Publisher's Foreword. We take the greatest pleasure in presenting this latest and best work from the pen of William Walker Atkinson. It embodies the essence of years of thought, study, and experiment on the part of its author, whose original research, discoveries, and writings along these lines have given him his worldwide reputation as an authority. It is his masterpiece. A portion of its material was used in two of the author's previous works, viz. Mental Magic and Mental Fascination, both of which works were published by ourselves. Both of the said works are now practically out of print, and will be withdrawn from sale by us, as they will be superseded by this newer and more complete work. This foundation material has been edited, added to, changed, improved, and corrected by the author, in accordance with his increased experience and knowledge of the subject. Obsolete matter has been replaced by entirely new material, and the work is now strictly up to date. It is encyclopedic in extent and character, every phase of the subject being considered by the author and expressed in words charged with his dynamic vitality. It contains matter that well might have been expanded into several volumes. Chapter 1. The Mental-Dynamo. I wish to invite you to the consideration of a great principle of nature, a great natural force that manifests its activities in the phenomena of dynamic mentation, a great something the energies of which I have called mind power. My thought on the subject is based upon the fundamental conception that there exists in nature a dynamic mental principle, a mind power, pervading all space, immanent in all things, manifesting in an infinite variety of forms, degrees, and phases. I hold that this energy, or force, or dynamic principle, is no respecter of persons. Its service, like that of the sun and rain, and all natural forces, is open to all, just and unjust, good and bad, high and low, rich and poor. It responds to the proper efforts, no matter by whom exerted, or for what purpose called into effect. But the proper effort must be exerted, consciously or unconsciously, else there will be no operation of the force. I believe that the activities of this dynamic mental principle are intimately correlated to manifestations of the mental operations known to us as desire, will, and imagination. We shall learn something of the laws and principles and modes of operation of its energies and activities, as we proceed with our consideration of it, in this work. It may be difficult for you to grasp this conception of mind power at the start, but it will grow upon your understanding as its activities are presented to you, one by one, like a great panorama. My terms will be explained and illustrated by examples, as we proceed, so you need not analyze them at this point. It may be as well, however, to state that I have used the term dynamic in its original Greek sense, i.e., powerful, possessing power, etc. I have postulated of my conception of mind power that it pervades all space, is immanent in all things, and manifests in an infinite variety of forms, degrees, and phases. But, it may be urged, this is nothing more than science claims for the principle of physical energy. Then is mind power identical with the physical energy of science? Is it nothing more than a high form of mechanical or material energy? No, mind power is very far from being a blind, mechanical energy. It is a living, mental force, which I hold is behind the manifestations of physical energy and mechanical force. It is not the physical energy of science, but is something of the nature of a living will, which is rather the cause of physical energy, than identical with it. Let us take a familiar example. You desire to move your hand, and it moves. Why? Because of the manifestation of the wonderful and mysterious force called will, which is stored up within you, and which you have released to move the hand. You send a current of nerve force, which is really a manifestation of mind power or will force from your brain, along the nerves of the arm, which contracts the muscles of the arm and hand, and your desire is gratified. Your desire, or wish, set into motion the mind power which acted upon the material substance of your body and caused it to act. What was it that flowed along the nerve wires? Was it electricity, or magnetism? No. It was that subtle and mysterious thing that I am calling mind power, and which is bound up with the wall principle of mind. Mind power is an actual living force. It is the force that makes plants grow and animal bodies grow, and which enables all living things to move and act. It is the force which enables the growing mushroom to raise up the slabs of paving stone, or causes the roots of a tree to split open the great boulders, into the crevices of which they have crept. Mind power is not an abstraction or speculative nothing, it is an existent, living, mental, acting force, manifesting sometimes with an appalling power, and sometimes with a delicate, subtle touch that is almost imperceptible, but which accomplishes its purpose. In order to reach a clear conception of the universality of mind power, let us consider its manifestations as we see them, unquestioned, in the universe on the many planes of life and activity. Beginning with the more familiar instances of its operation and manifestation, let us then proceed to delve still deeper until we reach instances not so easily perceived, and then still further back until we find it in places and in things that are generally regarded as lacking in mind power and life. And here let me say that I hold that life and mind power are always found in company with each other. There is some close relationship between the two, they are probably twin phases of the same thing, or else twin manifestations of the same underlying reality. There is no life without mind and mind power, and no mind power, or mind, without life. And, further, I claim that there is nothing without life in the universe, nothing lifeless there, or anywhere. The universe is alive, and has mind and mind power in every part and particle of itself. This is not an original idea of my own, of course, the leading scientific thinkers admit it today, and the Hindu philosophers have known it for 50 centuries. Do you doubt this? Then listen to these authorities who ably express the thought of their scientific schools. Luther Burbank, that most wonderful man who has revolutionized our conceptions of plant life, and who has practically held plant life in the palm of his hand, says, "All my investigations have led me away from the idea of a dead material universe tossed about by various forces, to that of a universe which is absolutely all force, life, soul, thought, or whatever name we choose to call it. Every atom, molecule, plant, animal, or planet, is only an aggregation of organized unit forces held in place by stronger forces, thus holding them for a time latent, though teeming with inconceivable power. All life on our planet is, so to speak, just on the outer fringe of this infinite ocean of force. The universe is not half dead, but all alive." Dr. Saleeby, in his important scientific work, Evolution, the Master Key, goes even still further in his claim of a living universe, and life accompanied by mind. He says, among other things, life is potential in matter, life energy is not a thing unique and created at a particular time in the past. If evolution be true, living matter has been evolved by natural processes from matter which is, apparently, not alive. But if life is a potential in matter, it is 1,000 times more evident that mind is potential in life. The evolutionist is impelled to believe that mind is potential in matter. I adopt that form of words for the moment, but not without future criticism. The microscopic cell, a minute speck of matter that is to become man, has in it the promise and germ of mind. May we not then draw the inference that the elements of mind are present in those chemical elements carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, sodium, potassium, chlorine that are found in the cell? Not only must we do so, but we must go further, since we know that each of these elements, and every other, is built up out of one invariable unit, the electron, and we must therefore assert that mind is potential in the unit of matter, the electron itself. Flammarion, the eminent French scientist, says, the universe is a dynamism. Life itself, from the most rudimentary cell up to the most complicated organism, is a special kind of movement, a movement determined and organized by a directing force. Visible matter, which stands to us at the present moment for the universe, and which certain classic doctrines consider as the origin of all things, movement, life, thought, is only a word void of meaning. The universe is a great organism, controlled by a dynamism of the psychical order. Mind gleams through its every atom. There is mind in everything, not only in human and animal life, but in plants, in minerals, in space. Professor J. A. Fleming, in his work on waves, air and ether, says, in its ultimate essence energy may be incomprehensible by us except as an exhibition of the direct operation of that which we call mind and will. Let us then follow the hint given by the scientists. Let us proceed to examine the evidences of the immanence of life and mind power in all of the things of the universe, things organic, things inorganic, and things beyond organism, shape and form, back into the very ether of space itself. And in the search we shall find these evidences everywhere in all things. Nowhere does life and mind power escape us. Immanent in all things, manifesting in an infinite variety of forms, degrees, and phases, we find these twin principles. I invite you to join in one of the most interesting and fascinating explorations known to modern science. We do not need any proof to demonstrate the existence of life, mind, and mind power in man, or in the lower animals. The activities resulting from its presence are in constant evidence. And if we examine the plant kingdom, we will see manifestations of life, mind, and mind power there also. Plants not only manifest appetency, or the instinctive tendency on the part of low forms of organic life, to perform certain acts necessary for their well-being, particularly in the selection and absorption of the material substances necessary for their support and nutriments, not only instinct or involuntary and unreasoning prompting or impulse, and the response thereto, but also, in certain cases, there appears mental action closely akin to conscious choice and will. I refer you to the many recent works on mind in plant life for illustrations and proofs of this statement. And biology shows us that there is life, mind, and mind power inherent in the cells of which our bodies, blood and the material of animal and plant life, is composed. These cells are little lives, and manifest mental power and faculty. They perform their particular functions, and live, grow, reproduce themselves, and act just as do the tiny forms of animal life at the bottom of sea, the latter being but little more than single cells, or cell groups. The possession of memory on the part of the cells of organic matter is an accepted scientific fact. At this point the orthodox and conservative scientist usually stops, drawing a line between organic and inorganic matter. But the daring minds of advanced scientists of today have brushed aside the dividing line, and have moved to a position where they meet the Hindu philosophers and the occultists, and now admit and teach that life, mind, and mind power invade the inorganic world to its utmost limits, and that universe is indeed alive and possesses mind. Some of the lower forms of organic life, so-called, possess no organs, and are but masses of jelly-like matter without signs of even rudimentary organs, and yet these life forms show evidences of desire, choice, and will. And science has admitted the existence of life and mind in the crystals. The latter growing in a manner showing vital and selective energy, and even rudimentary sex. More than this, the metals and minerals, under scientific tests, have shown responses that are similar to the same action in organic life, showing life and rudimentary sensation, the latter of course being a manifestation of mind. Some of the cold, careful scientific records read like fairy tales to those not familiar with the wonderful achievements of recent science. I wish that I had the time and space to recount these tests, but I must hasten on. Enough to say that in mineral and metallic forms there has been found response indicating the existence of sensation in varying degrees, and that in the crystallization of minerals and metals there has been evidenced the action of the same instinctive mental life energy which as appetency or instinct builds up the bodies of living organic forms. If you wonder at this, think of the miracle which is performed every second by plants absorbing the minerals of the earth, which are then converted into living plant cells. Then we eat the plants and convert the plant cells into animal cells which serve as the basis of our blood, muscles, organs, and even our brains. In fact, every particle of organic substance was evolved in this way. Think over this and you will see that nature is one in her essence, and that she is alive and possesses mind power. But we do not stop even at this advanced point. Minerals, and all forms of matter are composed of infinitesimal atoms, or particles. The particles combine by reason of some inherent attraction existing between certain of them, known as chemical affinity, etc. Chemical affinity is a peculiar thing. It manifests in likes and dislikes, loves and hates. It is impossible to study these manifestations without recognizing an elementary manifestation of like and dislike, love and hate. You think that this is far-fetched, do you? Well, listen to these words from some of the leading scientists about this power to receive sensations, and power to respond to the same, and maybe you will change your mind. Haeckel, the great German scientist, holds that the atoms of which matter is composed may receive sensations, and respond to sensations. He dwells upon this fact in his latest works The Riddle of the Universe, and The Wonders of Life, and writes as follows regarding sensation in the inorganic world. I cannot imagine, Haeckel says, the simplest chemical and physical process, without attributing the movements of the material particles to unconscious sensation. He also says, in another place, the idea of chemical affinity consists in the fact that the various chemical elements perceive the qualitative differences in other elements, experience pleasure or revulsion at contact with them, and execute specific movements on this ground. He adds, later, that the sensations and responses in plant and animal life are connected by a long series of evolutionary stages with the simpler forms of sensation that we find in the inorganic elements and that reveal themselves in chemical affinity. Nageli, another scientist, says, if the molecules possess something that is related, however distantly, to sensation, it must be comfortable to be able to follow their attractions and repulsions, uncomfortable when they are forced to do otherwise. And so you see that science now is preparing to admit elementary life and mind power in the atoms and particles of matter. But we have not as yet reached the utmost limit of scientific investigation regarding the presence of mind in the universe. Further than the atoms, you may ask. Yes, further than the atoms. What is true regarding the atoms, is true of the ions or electrons of which they are composed. These tinier particles are attracted and repelled, form groups and combinations which regulate the kind of atom produced, and manifest the same kind of affinity that is noticeable in the atoms. And more than this, these particles, as well as all forms of physical energy, are believed to emerge from the ether, that subtle, tenuous, universal substance, which, although unseen and intangible, is held to exist in order to account for the phenomena of the universe. If there is mind in the particles that emerge from the ether, is it too much to claim that there must be mind in the ether itself? Is this preposterous? Not so. Listen to the words of the following scientific authorities on the subject. Flammarion says, mind gleams in every atom. There is mind in everything, not only in human and animal life, but in plants, in minerals, in space. Cope says, the basis of life and mind lies back of the atoms, and may be found in the universal ether. Hemstreet says, mind in the ether is no more unnatural than mind in flesh and blood. Stockwell says, the ether is coming to be apprehended as an immaterial, superphysical substance, filling all space, carrying in its infinite, throbbing bosom the specks of aggregated dynamic force called worlds. It embodies the ultimate spiritual principle and represents the unity of those forces and energies from which spring, as their source, all phenomena, physical, mental and spiritual, as they are known to man. Dolhe says, possibly the ether may be the medium through which mind and matter react. Out of the ether could emerge, under proper circumstances, other phenomena, such as life, or mind, or whatever may be in the substratum. And so, we have the best of authority to support the inevitable conclusion that there must be mind power even in the ether. For my own part, I go still further, and for several years back have been claiming that the ether and the universal mind power principle are one and the same thing, that is, that theoretical something that science has called the ether, is in reality the universal mind power principle from which all manifestations of activities emerge, the universal mental dynamo. I cannot prove this, of course, but it is logical. But my argument does not depend even upon this, for admit that there is mind power in the ether, and my case is one. And in the ether it must be, even if the ether is not but another name for it. For if mind power is not in the ether, from whence does it come into the particles of matter, and in matter itself, organic and inorganic? Resting the consideration for a moment, let me say that with mind as reason, intellect, etc., I have nothing to do in this book, for this is a consideration of the dynamic phase of mind, the power phase, mind power, or dynamic mentation. I am trying to show you that mind power exists everywhere, and is manifest in every activity of the universe. In every activity of the universe, you say, surely you do not include physical activity and energy such as natural forces, etc. Yes, I do mean just that. How can that be, you ask? What has mind power to do with electricity, light, heat, magnetism, gravitation, etc.? It has everything to do with them, in my opinion. I will explain it to you in a few words, for I cannot go into this subject at length in this book, but must hasten on to the other parts of my subject. Here it is in a nutshell: all the forms of natural physical energy, or forces, known as light, heat, electricity, magnetism, etc., are held by science to be forms of energy arising from the vibration of the particles of matter. Now what causes the vibration? Motion of the particles, of course. And what causes the particles to move? Just this, the attraction and repulsion existing between them. And what causes the particles to exhibit this attraction and repulsion toward each other? Now here is where we get to the heart of the matter. Listen well. We have seen that the particles are attracted to, or repelled by, each other in the matter of likes and dislikes, love and hates, or pleasure or revulsion, or comfortable and uncomfortable experiences related, however distant, to sensation, etc. And these attractions and repulsions are held to result from capacity to experience sensations and the power to respond to sensations. And both the power to receive and experience sensations, and to respond thereto, are manifestations of mentality, which Haeckel has compared to desire and will. And if mentality is the cause of the sensations and of the response there, and the latter are the causes of the attractions and repulsions, and the latter are the causes of the motion, to and fro, of the particles of matter, and the latter, in turn, is the cause of the vibrations, and the vibrations are the causes of the manifestations of light, heat, electricity, magnetism, etc., then am I not justified in claiming that mind and mind power are the motive force of all physical energy? And am I not justified in postulating the existence of an universal mental dynamic principle? I tell you, friends, that the future will show that this dynamic mental principle is the source of energy, not energy the source of mind. I know that this is revolutionary, but I believe that it will meet the requirements of the future. I have been preaching this thing for several years now, and many have been the smiles, the jeers, and the sneers. But, from the beginning, I have felt a keen appreciation of the words of Galvini, when he said, bitterly, I am attacked by two very opposite sects, the scientists and the know-nothings. Both laugh at me, calling me the frog's dancing master, but I know that I have discovered one of the greatest forces in nature. And, now, in conclusion, I must ask you to form a mental picture of this great universal dynamic mental principle, pervading all space, immanent in all things, and manifesting in an infinite variety of forms, degrees and phases. We can think of it only by means of symbols. Let us then consider it as a great living, throbbing, pulsating, mentating ocean of dynamic mind power. In the depths of that ocean of mind power there is quiet, and calm and peace, the embodiment of latent power, and potential energy. On its surface are ripples, waves, great movements of energy, currents, whirlpools, eddies, phases of fierce tempest alternating with phases of calm and quiet. And from the depths of that ocean of mind power, all mental and physical power emerges, and to its bosom all must return. And in that ocean there is an infinite store of energy, from which may be drawn that which the human centers of consciousness and power require, when they learn the secret. This ocean of mind power is our only source of dynamic energy, but we have at our disposal as much of its force as we can carry off over our channels of supply. It is the use of this power that we call dynamic mentation. Now, do you understand what I mean by the universal principle of dynamic mind power, this universal mental dynamo? Several years ago I told a friend of this conception, and after he had listened to me attentively and with interest, he reflected a few moments, and then suddenly asked, "But where do I come in?" And that is the question that many of you are asking now, no doubt. Well, while here I cannot dip into metaphysics or philosophical speculation, or even into my favorite occult sources, I will say that each of you is a center of power in that ocean of dynamic mind power, and each is a master of the power. You have the whole thing back of you, and you are free to draw upon it for all that your channel will carry to you. And you are allowed to enlarge your channel. That is enough for this time, more will follow as we proceed. Chapter 2. The Nature of Mind Power. At this point I am confronted with the question that naturally arises when one begins to consider an unfamiliar object, subject, or principle, the question of, what is it? What is mind power is a difficult question to answer, for it implies a knowledge of the thing in itself, apart from its activities and manifestations. And this thing itselfness is something that the candid, scientific thinker admits is beyond the range of his thought and knowledge. Any attempt to answer such a question must involve one in a maze of metaphysical and philosophical speculation regarding something which is by nature unknowable. And so I may as well frankly state here that I do not purpose guessing at the thing in itselfness of mind power. For, at the best, any attempt at an answer would be merely a guess, for I do not know, neither do I know anyone else who knows. I am acquainted with the numerous speculations of the ancient and modern philosophers and metaphysicians on the subject. I have read and studied them, and have rejected them as mere theories unsupported by facts. And I have made and rejected a dozen or more theories of my own on the subject, all vague, foolish speculations. I have studied the best of what has been written and thought regarding this thing in itselfness of mind and mind power, so you see my ignorance is not the ignorance that comes from lack of thought, or lack of acquaintance with the thoughts of others, but is rather the ignorance that comes as the result of much thought, and much study of the thoughts of others, the ignorance that is only realized through knowledge. Regarding these ultimate questions, the best thinkers freely confess their ignorance, knowing that, as Nordau has said, they have plucked that supremest fruit of the tree of knowledge, the consciousness of our ignorance. Like Pyrrhon, some 25 centuries ago, they say, "Uden horizo, I do not decide." We do not know things in themselves, we cannot know them. If we knew the ultimate truths regarding the tiniest and most insignificant thing in the universe, we would know everything that is, for that tiniest thing is connected with, and related to everything in the universe, and that which underlies the universe, and to know the thing in itself of anything would be to know the great thing in itself of the all. All that we can do is to know and consider things by what they do, and how they act, and through their manifestations and activities, and the results and effects of the same, rather than by what they are in the abstract, or apart from their activities, manifestations, and the phenomena proceeding from them. Apart from their activities, manifestations, and phenomena, things are but abstract no things so far as our understanding is concerned, airy words coined by the metaphysicians and philosophers in order to provide food for speculation, argument, and dispute without end. And we may as well admit the fact that all consideration of ultimate things, things in themselves, inevitably leads us to the conclusion that the only real thing in itself is a something, underlying all things and yet a no thing, and which transcends all of our experience, knowledge, reason, thought, and even imagination. And therein lies the folly of attempting to tell just what anything is. In view of the facts mentioned, and which are held to be correct by the world's best thinkers, how much saner is it to devote our attention to the consideration of things as known through their activities, manifestations, and phenomena, knowing them by what they do, and how they act, by the laws and principles of the activities and operations, rather than by speculations concerning their nature as abstract thing in themselves. This is the method of modern science, as compared with those of speculative philosophy and metaphysics. But a little learning is a dangerous thing, and fools rush in where angels fear to tread. And so we shall never be at a loss for ingenious theories and solutions of ultimate problems. We have among us some who glibly inform us that they know just what mind is. Such add to the gaiety of the nations, and therefore are useful and interesting. Did you ever hear of the youth at college, who when asked by his professor, "What is electricity?" answered, "Well, sir, I did know, but I have forgotten." The professor answered, dryly, "Now, isn't that too bad? Here is the only person in the world who ever knew just what electricity is, and he has forgotten. What a loss to the race! Why do we not have courage enough to leave off this making of the speculative soap bubbles with which we have been amusing ourselves, and learn to answer honestly, 'I do not know,' or, at least like modern science, learn to frankly state, 'Here our knowledge of the subject ends, tomorrow we may know more, but sufficient for the day is the knowledge thereof, and an inch of knowledge of facts is worth a mile of unsupported speculation and theory.' As Thomas L. Harris has said. The theorist who dreams a rainbow dream and calls hypothesis philosophy, at best is but a paper financier, who palms his specious promises for gold. Facts are the basis of philosophy. Philosophy, the harmony of facts, seen in their right relation. And, now, having confessed your ignorance and mine, let us proceed to a consideration of mind power as known by its activities. In the first place, let me say that I do not hold that mind power is identical with mind. Rather does it seem to me to be correlated to mind, particularly in the operation of mind known as desire, will, and imagination. If you like, we may consider it to be the acting aspect of mind. Mind has three aspects: the aspect of being, or substance, the aspect of thought, with the subdivisions of reason, feeling, emotion, desire, will, etc., on both conscious and subconscious planes, and third, the aspect of acting. And it is in this aspect of action that mind is known as mind power. While it is extremely likely that there is a certain employment and manifestation of mind power in the ordinary processes of reasoning, intellectual effort, etc., still mind power seems to be more closely connected with the more elementary phase of mentation, such as feeling, emotion, and particularly desire and will. We know that it is possessed by the lower forms of animal and plant life, even the inorganic forms, all of which existed and employed the force before intellect and reason manifested itself in man. And so I would impress upon you that while mind power may be called into operation by, and still more certainly may be directed by the intellect, still you must not make the mistake of identifying it with that phase of mind or attributing it solely to creatures possessing the same. It is a far more elementary and basic force, as you have seen in the preceding chapter. Indeed, in order that you may understand the operations of mind power, you may as well get into the habit of considering it as correlated to that which we call will, as distinguished from intellect and reason. By will I do not mean that phase or faculty of the mind which decides, determines, or chooses, although this customary use of the term is quite correct as applied to one phase of will. This deciding, choosing, determining faculty is one of the attributes of intellect and self-consciousness superimposed upon the elemental will in the direction of guiding, directing, turning and restraining. It is the ego at the wheel, directing the ship of life by the chart of reason, the motive power being will, or mind power. Choice in the lower forms of life and activity simply means yielding to the strongest desire, or aggregate of strongest desires, or average of strongest desires. No, I did not mean will in the above sense, but in the more elementary sense of the term, the original sense, for the word is derived from the root meaning to wish, to desire strongly. And, in this elementary sense, the word will is used to designate that primitive, original, universal mental principle in life, which manifests in desire for action, and in the response to that desire. In this sense, will may be considered as desire will, both being held to be phases of the same thing, or rather the two poles of the same thing. The desire pole of this desire will is connected with that which we call emotion, feeling, etc., which arouses it into action. The will pole of this desire will is connected with that principle of mental activity which we are considering under the name of mind power, the dynamic aspect of mind. I ask that you reread this paragraph, that you may fix this idea firmly in your mind, for upon it depends the correct understanding of much that I shall have to say in this work. In desire we find the first step toward dynamic mentation. Desire precedes action of will, which releases the dynamic force of the mind power. Desire is the coiling up the steel spring of will. There is always a state of tension about desire, a state of coiled up energy caused by feeling, emotion or similar state which has been aroused by the sight of, or memory of, or thought of, some attractive object. The feeling inspired by the attractive object coils up the spring of desire, and this coiled up energy supplies the motive power of the will. But, remember this, some desires are acted upon, while others are rejected. Neither men nor things act upon every desire. There is the other pole of the desire will which must be called into action, and this leads us to a consideration of the matter of choice, determination, or decision, which is so often expressed by the term will, as I said a little further back. This choosing or determining phase of will is little more than an empty name or term, so far as is concerned the relation between desire and will action in the cases of things and creatures lower in the scale than man. For in these cases this choice, determination, or decision is based entirely upon the degree of feeling, or the degree of attractiveness of the objects presenting themselves to the attention, the strongest feeling, attraction, or motive interest winning the day. Fear is one of the strongest feelings influencing desire, and acts usually as a neutralizer of other feelings and desires, and is most potent as a motive influencing choice or decision. In fact, one is justified in regarding fear as the negative form of desire, being really a desire not to. With the advent of reason and intellect, particularly when the self-conscious ego appears, new elements are introduced, by reason of which man is enabled to deliberate and weigh motives, desires, feelings, emotions, etc. And thus the will of man is held to contain elements lacking in the general principle of will. But the aspect of will with which we are much concerned is the aspect of action, the will pole of desire will. Just where desire passes into will is impossible to decide, the chances are that they blend into each other. But this we do know, that something happens at a certain stage of the mental operation, whereby the attention of the thing, or ego, passes from the pole of desire to the pole of will, and then, one of two things happens, i.e. 1. Either the coiled-up spring of desire is released by the will, and the energy of desire is transmuted into the energy of will, which thus releases the mind power or dynamic quality of mind into action, or else, 2. The will refuses to be aroused, and desire slowly uncoils her spring, and the tension is relieved, gradually or at once. The will may be cultivated and developed so as to refuse to release the spring of desire into action, and in this inhibiting quality lies much of that which is called strength of will. It often requires more will not to do, than to do. The aspect of action is the true dynamic quality of will. And with action all will is intimately and inseparably connected. As Professor Hawley says, will concerns itself with action. The student must keep that fact before him, no matter how complex the matter seems. Action is the inner meaning and reason of the will. And it is with this phase that we are concerned in the present work. Action is the essential aspect of mind power, the latter exists for the purpose of acting. It is the essence of activity. And so you will see that this universal dynamic mental principle, which I have called mind power, is not that phase of mind which manifests as intellectual, reasoning processes, but is that phase of mind which is aroused by desire will and which acts. It is manifest in the universe among forms of life below the plane of reason, as well as among those on that plane, and therefore precedes reason in evolution. It also manifests along unconscious and automatic lines, and precedes the self-conscious stage of man. It represents an elementary, primitive, fundamental, dynamic, mental force, and may be thought of as a raw, crude, undeveloped force, manifesting along the lines of instinctive action or appetency, rather than along the lines of intellect, reason, or the higher cognitive faculties. It is something far more elemental and basic than intellect. It is more nearly akin to the elemental life forces which we personify under the name of nature. Whether or not that which we know as reason or intellect were evolved from an elemental mind stuff, or whether these higher forms of mentality are something of an entirely higher and distinct nature, or whether, as the occultists hold, intelligence is the result of the influence of a spiritual ego, something distinct from mind, upon an elementary mind stuff, these are questions belonging to other phases of the general subject of being, with which we have nothing to do in the consideration of the subject before us. I have my own opinions and beliefs on these points, and so have each of you. We may differ regarding the same, but may still be able to examine the subject before us as co-workers, in spite of our lack of agreement regarding questions of philosophy, metaphysics, or religion. We are dealing with a natural force, a universal energy now and here, and should examine and study its principles just as we would were it electricity, magnetism, heat, or light that we were studying. I am inviting you to a scientific study, not a metaphysical or philosophical speculation, doctrine, or theory. These latter things have their own good places, but they have no place here at this time. Chapter 3. Mentative Induction. As wonderful as is the manifestation of mind power within the limits of the form of the thing, cell, plant, animal, or person, and which produces the effects known as local action, movement, etc., there is still a greater wonder to be witnessed in the manifestation of the same power beyond the limits of the personality or form in which it originates. And it is to this manifestation of mind power that I am about to apply the term telementation. I may as well explain my terms at this place and time. In the first place, I use the term mentation, in the sense of mental activity, the term being derived from the Latin word mentis, meaning the mind, and the suffix ation, meaning action. So mentation means mental activity. From mentation we derive mentative, or relating to mental activity, mentate, or to manifest mental activity, etc., etc. From mentation, also, I derive the term, telementation, which so far as I know, was originally coined by me several years ago. The word is derived from the Greek word, tele, meaning far off, and the word mentation, above explained. Telementation means mental activity at a distance, or mentation exerted over space, or long-range mental influence, etc. I have been led to the coining of this new term designed to take the place of telepathy, for the reason that the latter term is improper and misleading. Telepathy, according to its root words, really means to suffer at a distance, or the feeling of the pain of another, the suffix pathy, being derived from the Greek word meaning to suffer. It may be used properly in connection with the sympathetic transference of pain, or disease, or similar mental state, but its use otherwise is improper. It is being discarded by the best scientific authorities, who prefer the term thought transference, etc. I have thought it advisable to use the term telementation in this connection, believing that it meets the requirements of the case better than any other term of which I have any knowledge. I expect it to come into general use before long. And now about the transference of mental states from one thing or person to another. I shall not attempt to go into a discussion of the phenomena of thought transference in this work, for the reason that it is too well established, and too generally known to require an argument in its favor from me. To thousands of careful investigators it is an established fact, and anyone who will take the time and trouble to conduct the experiments may reproduce the phenomena to his own satisfaction. Moreover, there are instances of telementation arising in the everyday life of nearly every person, such instances being of the spontaneous order, that is, not having been expected or sought after. Those who are desirous of obtaining proofs of telementation, beyond their own personal experiences, are referred to the records of the English Society for Psychical Research, which contain the carefully noted reports of many very interesting cases which have been conducted by the Society under the most careful supervision and scientific requirements. The circulation of mind power is as real a natural phenomenon as the circulation of air, water, or the blood. There have been many theories advanced to account for telementation, and there has been much talk of two minds, dual mentality, etc., in this connection. In this work I shall have very little, if anything, to say regarding man's two minds. I, of course, am fully conversant with the subject of the subconscious and superconscious regions of the mind, but I find this principle of telementation to have its roots still further back in the scale of evolution, back before consciousness as we know it existed in the created forms of matter or life, back to the plane of mind in inorganic matter, and therefore, I shall not attempt to urge any two-mind theories to account for it. In fact, I believe that the mind of man is a far more complex thing than a dual-mind combination. There are many more planes and regions of mind than the objective and subjective minds of the dual-mind authorities. I find the basis for the theory of telementation far back in the scale, in fact at the lowest extreme of the scale of things. I find it in the atoms, or in the particles of which the atoms are composed. In the first chapter of this work I called your attention to the manifestation of mind power among the atoms and particles of matter, which was evidenced by action, motion, and movements resulting from attraction and repulsion of these atoms and particles. In other words, I showed that physical forces were produced by the motions of the particles, or vibrations of the atoms, which arose from states of like and dislike, love and hate, attraction and repulsion, pleasure and pain, among these tiny particles of matter. And it is here that the elementary principle of telementation is noticeable. Here is where it may be seen in full primitive force and operation. If you will think for a moment, you will see that the motions of the atoms are twofold, viz. 1. The voluntary motion of the atom toward the other atom to which it is attracted by chemical affinity, and 2. The movement of the atom occasioned by the attractive force exerted by the other atom, in the same manner that a magnet draws the needle to it. Haeckel has told us that there is the voluntary movement of the atom itself, in response to the desire awakened in it by the attraction. How does it become aware of the presence of the other atom unless something passes between them? And that something must be in the nature of a mentative current, for there is nothing else to pass, because all other forms of energy being produced by vibrations of the atoms arising from mental states, the mind power must precede the physical energies, and must be the something that passes between the two atoms. Feeling the presence of the other atom, the first atom moves towards its affinity, voluntarily, and just as you move your arm or walk, the atom probably exerting a push upon the ether which must be to the atom or particle what the air is to the wing of the bird, or the water to the fin of the fish. But there is another cause of motion, as we have seen, the mutual pull of the attracting atoms. And what manner or kind of energy is it that thus draws or pulls the other atom? It cannot be electricity, or magnetism, for those forces, as we have seen, are produced by a rate of vibration occasioned by the mind power in the atoms themselves. Therefore we must go back to the antecedent force, which is mind power, and attribute to it the drawing or pulling force which moves the atoms toward each other. That this attracting or pulling force is in operation between the particles of matter, there can be no doubt. No two atoms of matter are in absolute touch with each other. There is always a distance between them, a space which thus separates them, which never can be traversed or overcome. There seems to be an individuality in these tiny particles which, although allowing them to form combinations, nevertheless prevents absolute blending or amalgamation. There is always a keep your distance, or thus far and no further principle in nature which holds every particle of matter individual and alone. Every ion, electron, atom, and molecule of matter is alone, and separated even from its closest affinity by a touch-me-not circle of influence, which is also mentative in its nature, in my opinion. Even the hardest diamond, or piece of steel, is composed of molecules close together but yet separated by this circle of influence, and every molecule is composed of several atoms between which the same law operates, and every atom is composed of many ions or electrons, which have distances between them. So true is nature in her proportions and laws, that scientists assert that in the hundreds of ions of which the tiniest atom is composed, and which atom is invisible to the sight by reason of its smallness, there is a distance between observed and maintained by these particles, which bears the same proportion to their sizes that the distance between the planets of our solar system bears to their particular sizes. In other words, that the ions composing an atom are akin to a minute solar system. Each ion being attracted to the other, and yet kept at its distance, the combined pull and push of the desire and the keep off, respectively, tending to cause them to circle round and round each other. And what is the force that traverses the space across which the particles themselves cannot travel? It is not electricity, or magnetism, for those forces are but the results of these circling and vibrations, and not their cause, and moreover science has not discovered electricity or magnetism between the atoms. And what holds the atoms and molecules of matter together, or rather in proximity, what causes their propinquity? Science answers, chemical affinity, and cohesion. But these terms are merely names, and science does not explain the nature of the force employed, but it knows that it is not electricity or magnetism, or any other known physical force. I answer, it is mind power exerted over the intervening spaces by telementation that attracts and holds these atoms and molecules in their places, and yet keeps them at their distance. Mind power, the existence of which in the atoms was postulated by Haeckel, and which always has been taught by the occultists. And, so finding that telementation exists in the elementary forms of substance and physical things, I am justified in looking for its presence and manifestation from that point of the scale upward. And I believe that the vibrations of mental states, feelings, desires, etc., are transmitted from one mind to another by telementation, arousing similar states, feelings, desires, etc., in the receiving mind along the lines of what we call induction in physical science. But before considering induction, I would ask you to consider the following quotation from Flammarion, the eminent French scientist, who says, "We sum up, therefore, our preceding observations by the conclusion that one mind can act at a distance upon another, without the habitual medium of words, or any other visible means of communication. It appears to us altogether unreasonable to reject this conclusion if we accept the facts. This conclusion will be abundantly demonstrated. There is nothing unscientific, nothing romantic in admitting that an idea can influence a brain from a distance. The action of one human being upon another, from a distance, is a scientific fact. It is as certain as the existence of Paris, of Napoleon, of oxygen, or of Sirius." He further states, "There can be no doubt that our psychical force creates a movement in the ether, which transmits itself afar like all movements of ether, and becomes perceptible to brains in harmony with our own. The transformation of a psychic action into an ethereal movement, and the reverse, may be analogous to what takes place on a telephone, where the receptive plate, which is identical with the plate at the other end, reconstructs the sonorous movement transmitted, not by means of sound, but by electricity. As I have said, I account for the transference of mental states, etc., by the theory of mentative induction, which I believe to be the theory more fully meeting the requirements of the case than any of the dual mind or similar hypotheses. The term mentative induction will be readily understood by those familiar with the phenomena of electricity. The word induction comes from the word induce, which means to influence. In electrical science, the word induction is used in the sense of the process whereby one body possessing magnetic or electrical properties reproduces that property in another body without direct contact. In textbooks on physics, a simple experiment is often given students to illustrate magnetic induction, as follows: a magnet is so placed that its poles project over the edge of a table upon which it rests. An iron nail, or steel needle, is held a little distance below the magnet so that it will not actually touch the latter but will be near enough to be magnetized by induction, that is, without direct contact. The nail, or needle, will have an induced property of magnetism produced by the current from the magnet, and will support another nail, or needle, by direct contact. This induced magnetism renders the nail, or needle, a magnet, possessing all the properties of the original magnet, so long as the current flows. And, just as a magnet may communicate its properties by induction, so may an electrified body communicate electrical states in another body without actual contact. The textbooks are full of examples to illustrate this law. The theory accepted by science is that the induction is the action of the electrical current through the ether, by waves of vibration. And I hold that just as the vibratory waves of magnetism and electricity pass through the ether and produce similar properties in other bodies by means of induction, so do the vibratory waves of mind power, from one mind, pass through the ether, and by induction set up similar mental states in the minds of other persons within the field of induction. I hold that just as the excitement of the particles of matter, excitement being merely aroused activity, may manifest an energy that may be transmitted to another object, removed in space from the first, and then may arouse by induction a similar state of excitement in the particles of the second object, so may the excitement of the mind among the brain cells of the animal or person be transmitted by telementation to another animal or person in whom, by mentative induction, a similar state of excitement is generated or induced. I hold that there is the closest possible relationship between motive energy and emotive energy, in fact, that both are forms of the same thing. I shall not attempt to go into details regarding telementation or mentative induction at this place, for the reason that I shall bring out the principle in detail, from time to time, by pointing out the manifestations and activities of these principles. But I wish you to fix in your mind the elementary principles of mind power in its phases of telementation or long-distance effect, and of mentative induction, or the process by which like begets like on the mental plane as on the physical. The machinery of the mentative processes and activities being hidden from physical sight, we may understand these processes and activities better by using the illustration of corresponding physical processes and activities, particularly when the correspondences are more than mere resemblances, being operations of the same underlying natural laws. For this reason, the illustration or symbol of wireless telegraphy will help us to understand telementation, and electrical or magnetic induction will help us to understand the phenomena of mentative induction. And, now let us pass on to a consideration of the activities and manifestations of mind power, in its phases of telementation and mentative induction, in living creatures, beginning with the lower animals. Chapter 4. Mental Magic in Animal Life. I have spoken of the manifestation of mind power among the atoms and particles of matter, whereby the tiny corpuscles become aware of each other's proximity, and whereby they move voluntarily in response to the desire aroused by the attraction or affinity of the other atoms, and whereby they also exert a pull or drawing power on the other atoms, and respond to the same attracting force of the other particle. Ascending the scale, we find the crystals building up their forms by drawing material from the fluids in which they are immersed, and then building upon a set pattern and style, as truly as does the builder among the animals or among men. Passing on to the low forms of animal life, we find tiny life forms in the slime of the ocean bed, which are apparently no more than tiny drops of glue cells without a nucleus, which nevertheless perform the functions of all organic forms, being born, taking nutrition, assimilating, eliminating, growing old, and finally dying, after reproducing their kind by growth and division. But, the point that most concerns us is that although these creatures have no senses, or even rudimentary sense organs, they are aware of the approach of other creatures, and of their food. In some way they become aware of these things, how, man does not know. Moreover, they are possessed of the power of motion, and exert their will in the direction of moving from place to place. Some of these forms of life, when viewed under even a strong microscope, are seen to move by gliding from place to place, apparently at will, and with no perceptible employment of organs of motion such as false feet, fins, etc. They seem simply to move by pure will. How do they do this? How do they become aware of the approach of other creatures, without sense organs, or the rudiments of the same? It seems that mentation and telementation are manifested here. Rising higher in the scale, we find many insects seemingly endowed with the faculty of becoming aware of the presence of other insects at distances so great as to render the ordinary senses of no avail. Students of ant life relate many remarkable instances of this kind. Ants at a distance seem to be able to communicate with their fellows, summoning assistance, and directing the movements of ant armies. A professor in an American university has related that upon one occasion he met with an instance of telementation on the part of a colony of ants. He stated that he had placed a breeding cage of ants inside of a stone house, the latter having walls 16 inches thick, with no windows and but one door, the latter being so sealed and protected that it was impossible for even a tiny ant to enter its crevices. When approaching this house for the purpose of studying the progress of his ant colony, he would notice that other ants had collected on the outside of the walls, and were running about trying to get through the stone blocks. Then he tried the experiment of moving his ant cage from one part of the house to another, first placing it beside one wall, and then another, and so on, trying all positions and places. In each case, after each change, when he would emerge from the house he would find the outside ants grouped on the stone wall as near to the inside ants as possible, changing their position from side to side according to the position of the ant cage inside of the house. Many other instances of the possession of the power of telementation on the part of ants have been noted. Another authority relates that a pair of foreign moths were brought to England. There were no other moths of that kind in the country. One of them, the male, escaped in a part of England many miles distant from the place to which the remaining moth, the female, was taken. The female moth was placed in a tiny cage for security, and then set out of doors during the night. In the morning, much to the entomologist's surprise, he found the male moth clinging to the tiny cage which contained the female. It was the same male, undoubtedly, for in size, coloring, appearance, etc., it corresponded exactly, besides which there was not another moth of that particular species known to be in England. Similar experiments have been conducted with insects, and there is held to be ample grounds for believing that insects attract their mates by means of some mental power beyond the range of the ordinary senses. Schools of fish seem to have some method of instantaneous communication between the individual fishes composing them, for the entire school moves from side to side, turning sharply, etc., as if it were possessed of but a single mind. Some scientists have held that many of the lower animals who live in groups, schools, etc., have mental relations similar to those of the colonies of cells which seem to have a common mind. There is undoubtedly communication over distance of the cells of the blood in animals, and the phenomenon of the school of fish, just noted, may be analogous. At any rate, there is some sort of distant mental communication between the individual fishes. The same phenomenon is noted among flocks of birds, as many know who have witnessed the flights of large numbers of birds of different kinds. Wild animals undoubtedly have some subtle sense whereby they find each other when separated by long distances. The return of cats and dogs who have been carried miles from home, and the return of birds to their original places, after their migrations, may have a similar explanation. There may be subtle vibrations from places, people, and objects, which the animals sense at a distance. That animals exert a mental control over their fellows by some form of manifestation of mind power, there seems to be but little doubt among those familiar with the ways of animals, particularly of wild animals. There is a manifestation of something besides physical strength and prowess on the part of the animal. There is a mental something displayed. A. E. McFarlane, in a recent magazine article on the subject of bad animals, says, "Put two male baboons into the same cage, and they will open their mouths, show all their teeth, and blow at each other. But one of them, even though he may possess the uglier dentition, will blow with a difference, with an inward shakiness that marks him for the underdog at once. No test of battle is needed at all. It is the same with the big cats. Put 2, or 4, or a dozen lions in together, and they also, probably without a single contest, will soon discover which one of them possesses the mettle of the master. Thereafter, he takes the choice of the meat. If he chooses, the rest shall not even begin to eat until he has finished. He goes first to the fresh pan of water. In short, he is king of the cage. Among the animals we find many instances of the power of charming or fascinating, both of which I hold to be but varying forms of manifestation of mind power in the direction of powerfully influencing the imagination, desire, or will of another by mentative induction. This mental fascination, among the animals, manifests along 2 lines, viz., 1, along the lines of desire operating in the direction of sex manifestation, such as the winning of mates, etc., and 2, along the lines of will operating in the direction of overcoming the prey of the animal, such as the charming of birds by serpents, or of smaller animals by tigers, etc. These cases are capable of liberal illustration and proof, and natural history affords us full authority for accepting the same. I recently read an account of a naturalist, who related that one day in a tropical country he noticed a winged insect circling around and around a scorpion. After a bit, the insect made a series of desperate plunges at the scorpion, as if in a frantic desire to terminate the charm, the scorpion soon striking down the insect, and afterwards devouring it. It is related by travelers that when one comes suddenly in the presence of a lion, tiger, or leopard, his legs seem paralyzed, and the eyes of the beast seem to exert a peculiar fascination and power over him. I have seen a mouse manifest the same emotion in the presence of a cat, and the same is true of a rat in the presence of a ferret, or similar enemy. On the other hand, every observer has noticed the wonderful charming power that animals exert over others of their kind, of the opposite sex. If you have ever witnessed the courting of a bird, during the mating season, you will have a keen sense of the reality of the power employed. One of the birds, and it may be either a male or female, will be seen to actually fascinate or charm the one of the opposite sex, the latter lying still with quivering wings, and a helpless expression in its eyes. When compared with the attitude of the same bird, when charmed by a serpent, the resemblance will be striking. I have before me a book written in 1847, which relates quite a number of instances of the operation of mental fascination among the lower animals. I will give you a few of them, condensed and abbreviated. Professor Silliman is quoted as stating that one day, while crossing the Hudson River, at Catskill, he passed along a narrow road with the river on one side, and a steep bank, covered by bushes, on the other side. His attention was attracted by the sight of a number of birds, of a variety of species, who were flying forward and backward across the road, turning and wheeling in strange gyrations, and with noisy chirpings, seemingly centering over a particular point of the road. Upon examination the professor found an enormous black snake, partly coiled, and partly erect, showing an appearance of great animation, with his eyes flashing like a brilliant diamond, and his tongue darting in and out. The snake was the center of the motion of the birds. The professor adds that although the snake disappeared in the bushes, frightened at the approach of the men, still the birds seemed too dazed to escape, and perched on the nearby bushes, evidently awaiting the reappearance of their charmer. The same book relates an incident of a man in Pennsylvania, who saw a large black snake charming a bird. The bird described gradually decreasing circles around the snake, at the same time uttering piteous cries. It seemed almost ready to drop into the jaws of the snake, when the man drove off the latter, when the bird arose with a song of joy. Another case is related of a ground squirrel, which was observed running to and fro between a creek and a large tree a few yards distant. The squirrel's fur was badly ruffled, and he exhibited fright and distress. Investigation disclosed the head and neck of a rattlesnake, protruding from the hole of the tree, and pointing directly at the squirrel. The poor squirrel at last gave up the fight, and yielding to the fascination, laid himself down with his head very close to the snake's mouth. The snake then proceeded to swallow the squirrel, when his meal was interrupted with a cut of a carriage whip in the hands of the observer, and the squirrel, released from the spell, ran briskly away. Dr. Good is quoted as having made quite a study of the curious fascinating power that rattlesnakes manifest over small animals, such as birds, squirrels, young hares, etc. He relates that these animals seem incapable of drawing their eyes away from those of the snake, and, although seemingly struggling to get away, they still gradually approach the snake, as though urged toward him, or attracted by a power superior to their natural instincts. He goes on to state that the animal creeps nearer and nearer, until at last it is drawn into the serpent's mouth, which has been open all the while to receive it. Dr. Barrow is quoted as relating many instances of this kind, known to peasants in all parts of the world. Valiant, the African traveler, tells of an instance in which he witnessed a shrike in the very act of being fascinated by a large snake at a distance, the fiery eyes and open mouth of which were gradually approaching the bird, the latter manifesting convulsive trembling and uttering piercing shrieks of distress. The traveler shot the snake, but upon picking up the bird, he found it dead, killed either by fear or the power of the serpent, or perhaps by the violent breaking of the spell. He measured the distance between the snake and the bird and found it to be 3½ feet. A case is related in one of the early reports of the Philosophical Society, in which a mouse was put in a cage with a viper, by way of an experiment. The mouse at first seemed greatly agitated, which state was followed by a condition of fascination, the mouse drawing nearer and nearer to the viper, which remained motionless with distended jaws and glistening eyes. The mouse, finally, actually entered the jaws of the viper, and was devoured. Bruce, the African traveler, relates that the natives of an interior tribe seem to be protected by nature against the bite of scorpions and vipers. They are said to handle these creatures fearlessly, the latter seeming to be robbed of their power of resistance. He states that the creatures seem to sicken the moment they are touched by these natives, and are sometimes so exhausted by the invisible fascinating power that they perish shortly. He says, "I have constantly observed that however lively the viper was before, upon being seized by any of these barbarians, he seemed as if taken with sickness and feebleness, and frequently would shut his eyes, and would never turn his mouth toward the arm that held him." Personally, I have seen a somewhat similar case. When I was a boy, in Maryland, I knew of a farmhand who was called a snake charmer. How he did it, I never could find out, but he would exert some kind of influence over all kinds of snakes, poisonous ones included, and would cause them to remain fascinated until with a quick movement he would grab them by the neck with his bare hands. This man generally carried a few pet snakes around with him for company. They seemed perfectly contented, and would poke their heads up from out of his pockets, in order to look at someone else with whom he might be talking. The Negroes on the farm had a mortal terror of this man, and would walk a couple of miles rather than pass by his house. The power of charming animals, dogs, and wild beasts is undoubtedly possessed by some men, in varying degrees. And nearly everyone has known of men who could charm the wildest horses, as if by magic. I have read of some burglars who seemed able to quiet the most ferocious watchdogs. The Swedish writer, Lindekrantz, tells of certain natives of Lapland who are possessed of some process of charming dogs, to such an extent that they have been known to cow the most savage greyhound, causing him to fly from them with all the signs of abject fear. Many of my readers have seen, or heard of, the horse whisperers found in various parts of the country, who will shut themselves in a stable with a fierce horse, and by whispering to him will manage to tame him completely, and make him passive to their will. There are cases recorded in which men who have been charmed by a snake, have afterwards given in their experience. One of these cases relates that the man was walking in his garden when he suddenly came into the presence of a snake whose eyes gleamed in a peculiar manner. He found himself fascinated, as if by a spell, and unable to withdraw his eyes from those of the creature. The snake, he stated afterward, seemed to begin to increase immensely in size, and assumed, in rapid succession, a mixture of brilliant colors. He grew dizzy and would have fallen in the direction of the snake, had not his wife approached, throwing her arms about him, and breaking the spell. Another similar case is related, in which a man found his companion standing still on the road, with his eyes fixed intently upon those of a huge rattlesnake which was regarding him fixedly with gleaming eyes, scintillating in its raised head. The man was leaning toward the snake, and would have fallen toward it in a few moments. He was crying, feebly, but piteously, "He will bite me. He will kill me." "Sure, he will," replied his friend, "why don't you run away? Why are you staying here?" But the man seemed perfectly dazed, and distracted, and could not answer. The companion finally picked up a stick and struck at the snake, which glided away savagely. The fascinated man was sick for several hours afterward. When I was a boy, I had a somewhat similar personal experience, although not nearly so serious. Walking one day among a grove of trees belonging to my grandfather, I found myself standing staring intently at a snake about 2 feet long whose eyes glistened like large diamonds. In a moment I ceased to see anything but those awful eyes which glistened and displayed all the prismatic colors to my frightened glance. It lasted but a moment, however, for the snake glided away, seemingly as anxious to get away from me as I was to part company with him. I cannot say whether the spell would have been broken by me. If the snake had not moved away, perhaps it might, or perhaps not. All that I remember now, after the passage of 35 years or more, is that I did not seem to feel fear after the first shock, my feeling and emotion seemingly being that of great wonder and amazement arising from what I saw in those eyes. But I have said enough regarding the manifestation of mentative induction among the lower animals. There are many interesting instances of this sort, scattered through the pages of books on animal life, and nearly everyone who has lived in the woods, or among wildlife knows of many cases illustrating this fact which have come under his own observation. I have mentioned these features of the subject merely for the purpose of showing you that we have to deal with a general natural principle which manifests throughout all life. This book has to deal with the manifestation of this force among men. But in closing this chapter, I would ask you to notice the resemblance between the manifestation of the force among the animals, on the one hand, and among mankind on the other. The animals employ the force for 2 purposes, i.e., the captivating of mates, and the capture of prey. And how do men and women use it? Along similar lines. Yes, I mean this, as startling as it may appear. For is not the use of fascination, in the direction of attracting the other sex akin to the sex charming noticed among the birds and animals? And is not the use of fascination in the direction of influencing men and women along the lines of business, or personal interest, akin to the charming of prey by wild animals, serpents, etc.? You may see that evolution simply changes the form of use in this and other natural qualities, and power, the force or power remaining the same, under all of the changes. And does it not become important for us to understand, study, and guard ourselves against the employment of such an elemental force as this, which manifests along all planes of life, from lowest to highest? Chapter 5. Mental Magic in Human Life. Passing on from the lower animal life to the plane of human life, we find on all sides many manifestations of mind power along the lines of telementation and mentative induction. Now, as never before, is this mighty force being employed for worthy or unworthy purposes in everyday human life. On the one hand, we hear and see it being used for the curing of the ills to which the flesh is heir, many of which ills, by the way, having been brought on by improper methods of thinking, by the adverse suggestions of advertisements describing diseases, urging patent medicines, etc., as well as by the ignorance of the masses of people regarding the effect of negative thoughts and depressing autosuggestions. We also see mind power employed through the channel of suggestion, being exerted to bring about better and more positive mental states among those who have been manifesting negative mental conditions. We also witness the exploitation of mind power, under various names by numerous cults, sects, and organizations, through many schools, teachers, and publications under many different names, and backed up by various authorities. We also see the same force being improperly used in hypnotic exhibitions, and in other forms calculated to weaken the wills and positive mentality of other persons. But it is all the same power, no matter how used. Like any other natural force, it may either be used for the service of mankind, or for its hurt. I would caution the student of this work from being misled by the many names and terms used by teachers and writers describing some form of mind power, and which the said persons claim to be something new, or something different. It is always the same old thing, as old as creation, and just as universal as is electricity or light. When you have become acquainted with the fundamental principles underlying this great natural force, you will be able to recognize it, always, beneath its many disguises, garbs, titles and formulas. The same old mind power, you will find it. Whether in the form of personal magnetism, or the subtle fascinating charm of one mind over another, that form of mental force that influences as if by an irresistible charm, that bewitches, allures, charms, enchants, attracts, or in what has been called fascination, in which one person is able to influence another by exercising a powerful influence upon his or her affections, emotions, passions, or thoughts, or in some of the other similar forms of the exercise of an unseen, inexplicable influence upon others, or in the phenomena known as psychologism, etc. With which all are more or less familiar, or in the phenomena attendant upon the revival of the ancient occultism in the last 20 years, under various names and forms, the fundamental principle of which consists in forms of mental treatments of one kind or another, present or absent, or in the phenomena of what has been called suggestion, of which we hear so much in scientific circles, or in the various forms of mind or faith cures, of which so much has been heard of late years, and upon which a number of religions and cults have been built, or in the repulsive forms of mental influence, known as black magic, etc., etc., we have the same fundamental principle, and manifestation of some phase of the general phenomena of mind power. The same cause is under all its manifestations, good or bad, black or white. It is all the operation of the one great law, or principle of nature. We see on all sides men who seem to exert a wonderful and mysterious mental influence upon others, upon those associated with them, or upon the public mind. Leaders spring into prominence, apparently owing their power to some mysterious influence over the minds and wills of others. Some attain power and position, others attain wealth and social state, by reason of some inner force. When we meet certain people, we become at once impressed by a something about them that makes its power and influence felt by us. They seem to radiate a peculiar force that bends our wills captive, and causes us to fall in with their desires, to a greater or lesser extent. We know that when some people enter a room, they bring with them an indefinable influence that becomes apparent to all. Certain houses and stores have atmospheres of their own, which are perceptible to those entering them. Some places are depressing to all who live or do business in them. Some salesmen impart a sense of confidence and trust at once, while others cause the reverse. Some persons attract, others repel. Some people seem to have a way of influencing the minds of others with whom they come in contact, so that these others will rally around the self-constituted leader, and thus cults, religion, and isms are formed. We all know how far a strong magnetic leader may carry his followers. We have seen many instances of it during the past 20 years. People have followed some of these leaders like a flock of sheep. And they will always do so, until the underlying principle is understood and people protect themselves. And all of these things go to form part of the phenomena of mind power. Surely the subject is worth investigating. Now, as never before, the subject of the mystic forces of mind power is attracting the attention of the majority of thinking people. In ages past, the knowledge of the subject was possessed by but the few, who jealously guarded it from the minds of the masses, the latter obtaining but scraps of the hidden knowledge, and that adulterated with the grossest superstition and attributed to the particular form of primitive religion prevailing in the particular place, at that particular time. And even now, notwithstanding the popular interest in the subject, but very few have arrived at a scientific understanding of the matter, and the majority take their knowledge of the new psychology in the capsule of dogma and theory advanced by some particular cult or sect. Mind power has been known to the race, in one form or another, from time before history was written. In the earliest records we find many traces of it among all peoples. And, even today, it is known and practiced, in a more or less ignorant manner, by all races, from the people of the highest civilization known to us, down to the ignorant African bushman. Many have been turned away from a serious consideration of the subject by the fact that many of its forms have been accompanied by the grossest superstition, and the most absurd repulsive ceremonies. They have failed to see that underlying all the extravagant ideas and methods of application, there was to be found a fundamental law of nature, as real and as constant as any other natural law or force. And, inasmuch as this law is in constant operation, and all are subject to its influence and effect, does it not become the duty of intelligent people to acquaint themselves with this mighty force or law, in order that they may understand its workings, take advantage of its benefits, and protect themselves against its misuse? Believing that there is but one answer to this question, this book has been written in order to throw light on a subject commonly left in the dark, or at least in the twilight of the human understanding. I am fully aware of the fact that many ingenious theories have been advanced by modern writers attempting to account for the phenomena of mind power. But all students of the subject are aware that these theories, cleverly as they have been designed, are more or less self-contradictory, and many a reader has thrown aside the subject in disgust after a vain attempt at reconciling the opposing views. And to make the matter worse, various cults and sects and isms have sprung into existence, the promulgators and leaders of which have used the accepted phenomena of mind power as a foundation upon which to build airy structures of religion, philosophy, and metaphysics. Many of these cults have practically claimed a monopoly of the great natural force, and have assumed the right to be the sole custodians of the secrets thereof, alleging that they have the only real article, all others are base imitators, notwithstanding that all of them show that they have arrived at least a working knowledge of the force, and are obtaining results, each obtaining about the same percentage of successes, notwithstanding the fact that each denies the other the fact of possessing the information and right to use it. Is it not apparent to any intelligent observer that they are all using the same great natural force, in spite of their conflicting theories, and that their results are obtained in spite of their theories, rather than because of them? In a former work, which has served as a basis for the present one, I grouped the phenomena of the manifestations of mind power under the general term of mental magic, the use of the term being justified by the following facts. The word magic was derived from the Persian word mag, meaning a priest. The Persian priests were wonder-workers, or magicians, the latter word being derived from the word magi, the name of the hereditary caste of priests of ancient Persia and Media. This Magian order, or esoteric cult of the Zoroastrian priesthood, represented the center of ancient occultism at that period of the world's history, and its influence was felt in all parts of the world, and continues down to this time. So highly were its members respected and considered, that the term wise men and magi were synonymous. The three wise men mentioned as appearing at the birth of Christ, Matt. 2, were known as the magi, or wise men from the east. From the word magi came the term magic, which Webster has defined as follows: the hidden wisdom supposed to be possessed by the magi, relating to the occult powers of nature, mastery of secret forces in nature, having extraordinary properties, seemingly requiring more than human power, etc. So we may consider the word magic to mean mastery of the occult forces of nature, the term indicating the existence of such forces, and the possibility of the mastery or control of them. And in ancient times, magic was always believed to be connected in some way with the use of the mind, particularly in its aspects of will, desire, and imagination. Effects were believed to result because some magician either willed it, desired it to be, or else imagined it would occur, in each case the result happening as a materialization of the mental conception or wish. Wishing was always believed to be a magical operation, and if we examine a wish we see it is composed of the use of the imagination, coupled with desire, and backed up with will. And so, I felt that I was justified in using the term mental magic in considering the various phenomena resulting from the manifestation of mind power. But by the use of the term mental magic, I meant more than the mere mental control of the occult forces of nature. I meant that these occult forces of nature are themselves mental in character and nature, and that their control or mastery means simply the conscious use, control, mastery, and application of certain mental forces, called occult, that are possessed by the race, and are used by all, either consciously or unconsciously. The mastery or control of these forces means that one may learn to knowingly apply that which all have been using blindly and unknowingly. And as knowledge and intelligent use always means power, the knowledge of the principles of these forces, and the consequent intelligent application of them brings power to those acquiring it. While it is true that that which is known as magic has always been mixed up with a mass of credulity, superstition, and meaningless forms and ceremonies, the close student will see that these excrescences and appendages necessarily arose from the superstitions of the mass of the people, and to the various forms of primitive religions that the race has fostered during the procession of the centuries and ages. The magicians were nearly always priests in the old days, that being the only career open to them, and one that enabled them to erect the barrier of primitive religious rites between their wisdom and the ignorance of the race. The careful student will be able to trace the possession of something real and true always manifesting among the various forms and ceremonies of the various ancient cults. There was always to be found an esoteric or inner cult, within the mass of the exoteric or ignorant priesthood and followers of the temples. There was always the light of truth burning in the Holy of Holies of the temples, for those who were sufficiently advanced to worship at its shrine. And, among the dim records of the ancient mysteries that have come down to us from ancient India, Egypt, Persia, Chaldea, Babylon, Greece, and Rome, and the other old centers of civilization and culture, we may always find the underlying principle of the existence of some mighty force connected with the human mind, or more particularly, the will, that was at the bottom of the mysteries, and magic, and miracles. Back of all the ceremonies, rites, and incantations was the esoteric idea that the will was the real force employed under the mask of incantation and rites assumed to impress the imaginations and minds of the populace. Back of the amulet and charm was the working of the will of the person wearing them, which was called into effect by the faith or imagination, a real power and not a fancy as many believe, of the man ignorant of the real force. As the writer on this subject in the Encyclopaedia Britannica has truly said, although he was ignorant of the truth underlying the silly forms, there being an evident relation between an object and the thought of it, it becomes one of the chief practices of the sorcerer to try to make things happen by thinking about them. And the same writer in another place speaks of the element in magic, not depending upon spirits, depends upon imagined powers and correspondences in nature, of which the adepts avail themselves in order to discover hidden knowledge, and to act upon the world around them by means beyond the ordinary capabilities of men. Thus by mere effort of will, etc., etc. And the student who will look under the surface, and read between the lines, will be able to see the evidence of mental magic underlying all the forms of magic, mystery, and wonder-working miracles of all times and ages, and people of all kinds, character or name. Behind all the masks he will see the features of this use of the mind power of man always the same, in spite of the fantastic and grotesque masks and trappings. I could fill pages with recitals of the many disguises under which mind power masquerades, but I must hurry on the telling how, and I can do no more than to hastily call your attention to the many evidences of the use of this power in all parts of the world, and in all times. The ancient mysteries of Egypt, Greece, etc., were systems of forms and ceremonies, wherein were hidden the use of mind power. The sick were brought to the temples and healed. The minds of the populace were filled with the thoughts of victory impressed upon them by the will and subtle suggestions of the priests. What we know in these days as mental suggestions, including that which we now call affirmations or autosuggestions, were understood and skillfully used by the priests, or magicians, in order to control the people. And it must not be for a moment supposed that these forces were used for evil purposes. On the contrary, the priests were the real governing classes, the powers behind the throne, and they felt the responsibility of power, and endeavored by their knowledge of the occult forces of the mind to lead the people in the right path. Of course, selfish men there have always been, and we hear of cases away back in the early days of history where this power was prostituted for evil and selfish purposes, just as power is always capable of wrong application. In all ages we learn of the healing of the sick by mental power, for mental healing presents an unbroken line from the earliest days down to the present, concealed often under fancy trappings, but the same in principle always. And what we call mental suggestion has always been in force in the hands of the leaders of the race to influence, for good or evil, those under them. The great leaders of men have always been adept in the use of mind power, although many of them have never suspected the sources of their power. To many it may seem almost sacrilegious to state that the highest uses of mind power, such as leading the race up to higher ideas, aims, and accomplishments, to success, happiness, and health, are merely higher forms of the same force that is used by the ignorant and repulsive savage in his rites and dark practice. But it is true. Mind power is like any other great natural force, it is above good or evil. It is neither good nor evil, but may be used for either. This is true of electricity, steam, explosives, and every other natural force. And we might as well look this fact squarely in the face, and govern ourselves accordingly. The same force that is used by the modern healer, when he or she treats a patient for health, success, or some other desirable quality, is the same used by the black voodoo, the Congo sorcerer, the Salem witch, the Hawaiian kahuna, who prays people into sickness and death, the medicine man of the American Indian, with his charms and incantations, the wizards and enchanters of the Middle Ages, the practitioner of adverse treatments, or malicious mental magnetism, of the modern cults. The same force pervades all, just as the same life force flows through the saint and sinner, the angel and demon, the dove and the serpent, the lamb and the tiger. Nature's one force through all. And just as mind power is brought into operation through the prayers of the faithful of all religions, before their shrines, images, and holy objects, so may the force be brought into operation through the fetishes, conjurations, enchantments, charms, spells and devil worships of the ignorant and depraved minds. The secret is this: the power does not come from the supposed source, but from within the mind of the man employing it. And, still more startling, to the uninitiated, is this statement, which is equally true: the power of the mind of the person affected is the real cause of the effect, rather than the power of the mind of the supposed causer, the latter merely calling into operation the power of the mind of the person affected. Passing from the past to the present age, we see in greater use than ever this wonderful mind power. No longer the property of the few, the information has filtered out among the masses, through various sources, and we see the force in use on all sides. Often, the persons using it have not the true knowledge of its real nature, and such persons often involve themselves in a terrible whirlpool of effects by reason of a selfish and base employment of this power. Many are playing with this force like children playing with dynamite. It is one of the purposes of this book to call the attention of such people to the nature of the force they are employing, and the possible, nay, probable, results of a misuse of it. Not that they are punished for such misuse, but rather by reason of it. Black magicians are invariably caught in the meshes of their own nets, are entangled in the psychic machinery of their own manufacture, and are blown up by their own psychic high explosives. In concluding this little consideration of the subject, I would call the attention of the student to the fact that now, for the first time in the history of the world, mind power is being employed for furthering commercial aims and ends. Mental treatments for wealth and success are commonly known and advertised. Instructions in the use of suggestion for commercial purposes are furnished both personally and in correspondence courses. The laws and principles are explained, partially, at least, in books written for the instruction of those selling or advertising goods, and otherwise soliciting the patronage of the public. It is true that the few strong men in business life have always made use of this force, consciously or unconsciously, but never before has it been taught generally as a part of a business education. It has been reserved for America to recognize the force, and to boldly apply it in this way, i.e., to the making of dollars. And other countries are fast falling in line. And in view of this fact, is it not time that those who know of the real nature, principles, and laws of this force should give to the world their knowledge, that the race may know with what they are dealing, and may he enabled to extract the good from it by proper use, and, seeing the evil possibilities of improper use, may avoid such prostitution of one of nature's greatest forces. Many students of the occult have sought to keep from the general public a knowledge of the fundamental principles of the great law of nature underlying the phenomena of mind power. They have claimed that it was dangerous for people generally to know that such a force existed and could be used. They have held that such knowledge should be carefully guarded by the few, and that its very existence should be denied to the many. This may have been good reasoning in the earlier days of the world, when the masses were grossly ignorant, and when the only knowledge was locked up in the minds of the caste of priests and other leaders of the race. But the argument no longer applies, for the general intelligence of the race has refused to allow any locked doors in the temple of knowledge, and has insisted that all doors be thrown open to them. The result has been that a considerable body of occult knowledge has been opened to the gaze of the public, and they are clamoring for more. Much of the knowledge possessed by the public regarding mind power is but quasi-knowledge, half-truths, and the time has come when the whole truth should be taught. The time has arrived when the public should be made acquainted with the great force underlying the phenomena of mind power. People should be instructed regarding this force, its laws and operation, its intelligent and proper use, with directions designed to protect people against its improper use against them, on the part of others, this latter a most important matter in these days of occult and psychic investigation on the part of the public, and the attempted base and selfish uses to which some are putting the occult mental forces of nature. It is too late to deny or ignore the existence of the mighty mental force in nature that underlies the various forms of phenomena that go to form the outward phase of mind power, good and bad. Too much has been witnessed by the public concerning these matters for them to be hushed by the old cry, "There's nothing in it but imagination." On the one hand they have witnessed the various treatments of the healers, tending toward the cure of disease, the attainment of success, etc. And on the other, they have heard whispers of adverse treatments, etc., and have heard of, or read, the various courses of instruction in hypnotism, mesmerism, etc., etc., and have seen evidences of the good and bad effects of what has been called suggestion, in all of its forms. And they are beginning to realize that all of these things, differing as they may seem, have a common root in some one natural force. And they are demanding, like the man from Missouri, to be shown. And they have a right to demand this. The race has always recognized the existence of a mighty force of nature which man has employed, consciously or unconsciously, in the direction of influencing his fellow men, other forms of life, and even the so-called lifeless things around him. In the earlier days this use of the force was called magic, black and white, mystical art, divine power, miracle, fascination, charming, enchantment, wonder-working, necromancy, etc., and in its more base and evil uses, black art, witchcraft, sorcery, voodooism, etc. For it must be remembered that this great force of nature is capable of base as well as of noble use. Like any other great natural force, like electricity, the power of explosives, steam, the X-rays, radium, etc., this great force is capable of the highest and most beneficial uses by man when properly applied, and is also capable of being applied to the most harmful purposes. Different as are the results arising from the varying applications, the force is the same in each case. The forces of nature are not possessed of a sense of good and evil. Their function and purpose is to act in obedience to the laws of their nature without regard to the question of good and evil to those by whom, or against whom, they are employed. This may seem like a terrible thing, but a moment's thought will satisfy you that it is true of all natural forces, and the question of good and evil, and its reward or punishment, belongs to another plane of life. But, it may be asked, why do I wish to inform the public about a force, unknown to many, which is capable of evil as well as of good use and results? The answer is simple. Ignorance is no protection against anything, for the knowledge is always possessed of the few who may use it on the ignorant many without suspicion. The greater publicity is given to a thing, and the better it is understood, the better may its good effects be obtained and the less the danger of its improper use. Forewarned is forearmed. If a thing is good, the greater publicity given it, the greater the good. If it is evil, the brighter the searchlight turned upon it, the less danger is there attendant upon it. The danger of all evils lies in the darkness of concealment, not in the daylight of publicity. Turn on the light has always been the watchword of progress and civilization. And more particularly is this so at this, the first decade of the 20th century, when the interest in occultism and kindred subjects has made a number of people acquainted with mind power, and has acquainted them with its uses, under various names and theories. And in many cases it is being practiced upon people who are unfamiliar with the subject, and therefore it is time that someone should turn on the light, that it may be seen by all men and known for what it is, capable of the highest and the lowest uses, but a great force of nature. And with this exposition of it, goes the remedy and protection against improper use, as well as the knowledge of its wonderful proper uses. If it be a bane, here is the antidote. But it is not necessarily a bane, any more than steam, electricity, and explosives are a bane to mankind. What would be thought of people who would suppress knowledge of all natural laws, because of the possibility of improper use? Ignorance is no protection. Truth and fact must be followed to the end, and it will be discovered that, in nature, every force that may be possible of hurtful use, may be guarded against by natural means. So much for the unpleasant side. But there is a very pleasant side to this subject of mind power. This force has come to man just when he most needs it. He has used the so-called mechanical forces to clear away the obstacles that nature put into his way in order to develop him into a man, and now he turns to higher forms of energy and work. He is crying for new worlds to conquer. And these new worlds will be conquered by the mind, rather than by the muscle. Great things are before the race, and one of the greatest forces in nature in the work of the building up of the Superman, will be this force called mind power. By it man will be enabled to fight off the forces of ignorance and materialism, and to draw to himself knowledge from the universal mind that will enable him to accomplish the heretofore impossible. In this book I shall treat mind power as I would any other great force or energy of nature, i.e., in a scientific manner, stating the principles plainly and without concealment, and also giving in full what I and other experimenters along the lines of this subject have learned of the methods beneficial, and the reverse, concerning the applications of these principles. In the case of the beneficial application, full directions will be given that the student may avail himself of the force to the fullest extent. In the cases where the subject of the harmful use of the force is alluded to, the student will be instructed how the same may be prevented, obviated, and neutralized, so that full protection is assured. This is what I should do in lessons upon electricity, steam, or explosives, and that is the course I purpose following in this work. It is possible that this course may bring upon me the adverse criticism of those who believe that the public is not ready for such knowledge, and that such things should be reserved for the few. To such people, and all others, I would say that I have no sympathy with such an attitude, and I believe that the race is ready for all the truth. And that which is proper for the few is proper for the many. I believe that the greater the degree of knowledge, the greater the degree of power and advancement. I believe that ignorance is not happiness, and that to keep a man ignorant of a natural fact, in order that he may escape its effect, is like allowing him to smoke when seated on a keg of powder rather than to acquaint him with a knowledge of explosives, or, to use another figure, to advise him to bury his head in the sand like an ostrich, rather than to look upon the approach of a possible danger. I do not believe in such sophistry. I do not believe in ignorance. I do not believe in darkness. Therefore, I purpose to turn on the light. Chapter 6. The Mentative Poles. Whatever mind power may be, in its ultimate nature, it is true that in its working nature or phase of operation it seems to work along similar lines to those followed by electricity. Like electricity, mind power undoubtedly has two poles, or phases. Like electricity, it travels in currents. Like electricity, it operates by induction. Like electricity, it is vibratory in its manifestation. And, like the higher forms of energy, superelectrical in nature, it possesses radioactivity, or radiant energy, that is, like many other forms of radiant energy, it is constantly throwing off streams of active energy, in the shape of rays, vibrations, or waves. Recent scientific discoveries have proven this, and in the next few years the world will be startled by additional discoveries along these lines. Already we are receiving hints of mental photographs, or radiographs, and before long we shall have telementometers that will register the telemental waves. The brain I regard as in the nature of a transformer of the universal mind power, or possibly as a converter of the force into mentation. The brain cannot create mind power, its office is merely to transform or convert the existent energy into usable forms and phases. Science agrees in the belief that in all brain processes there is an employment of some kind of energy, and a burning up of brain substance. Just as there is a constant burning up of the elements of an electrical battery in the production of electricity, so is there a burning up of brain matter in the production of mentation. And yet science teaches us that no electricity is ever created, simply a portion of the universal electricity is converted or transformed. And I believe that the same holds good in mental action in the brain. And now it is time for us to begin our consideration of the two mentative poles. In this book I shall hold to the fact there is evident in the manifestation of mind power, in any and all forms, two distinct poles, or phases. I find myself compelled to coin two more terms for these poles or phases, for there are none now in common use. I shall call these two mentative poles respectively the emotive pole and the motive pole. The word motive means, that which acts, wills, moves, chooses, controls. The word emotive means, that which manifests feeling, emotion, agitation, passion, sensation, etc. These definitions apply to my use of the terms in these lessons. You will be able to fix these two ideas connected with the mentative poles by thinking of the motive pole as will, and of the emotive pole as feeling. The emotive pole manifests actively as desire force. The motive pole manifests actively as willpower. These two poles play a most important part along the lines of telementation. Not only does desire cause the response of one's own will, but both desire and will are active forces in themselves, and act and react upon the desire and will poles of mentality of others. We shall see many evidences of this as these lessons progress. In fact, the entire theory and practice of mind power depends upon this underlying principle. Your strong desire force is able to rouse the will of another mind in response thereto. It may likewise set up vibrations in that other mind, awakening their similar desires. Your willpower may arouse desire in the mind of another, and cause action in accordance therewith. It may also overpower the will of another, and lead it captive. Your combined will and desire pouring out in the mentative current may produce a combined effect upon the minds of others by telemental induction. These two poles of the mind are both active and powerful in their effect. Both may be roused into intense activity, according to well-known laws, as we shall see. Let us take a few moments' time and consider the subject of desire force and willpower, before we proceed further. Those who have studied the phenomena of mind power have generally accepted the theory that the effect upon other people was produced by the thought of the sender, and all the teachings upon the subject have been along this line. I, too, fell into this error, and for many years taught of the power of thought, etc. But I have come to modify my views on the subject. Of course, everyone who has paid any attention to the subject knows that thought transference is a fact, telementation being an established reality. But there is a very great difference between the fact that thoughts may be sent and received like telegraphic messages, on the one hand, and that persons may be influenced and affected, and bent to the desire or will of another on the other hand. It is like the difference between thinking and doing in ordinary life. One may send his thoughts so that another may receive them, but what of this? What has this to do with the doing and compelling? It is evident that the real force must be looked for in some far more elementary and vital operation of the mind, than logical and reasoning thought. What is thought? Webster defines it as an exercise of the mind in any of its higher forms, reflection, cogitation. Nothing very dynamic about this, surely. We must look for something in the mind having more elementary force and power. Let us think a moment. What part of the mind seems to produce the greatest moving power and strength? Is it not chiefly that region of the mind that produces what we call emotions, feelings, desires, cravings, passions? Does not this part of the mind really cause the greatest incentive action on our part? Is not the whole moving force largely summed up in the two words desire and will? Think of this a moment. Why did you do this thing, and that thing? Is it because you thought about it by cold, logical reasoning, and acted upon the impulse given thereby? Or, was it not because you wanted to do it, desired to do it, felt like doing it? Is not always the feeling or desire precedent to and the originator of the action? And, as for thought, is it not used merely as an instrument to think up the best ways of manifesting the feeling or desire? Think of this, is it not so? Did you ever do a thing, except under compulsion, that you did not desire to do? And was not the desire the preceding cause of your every action? Desire is the great inciting power of the mind. Desire is that which incites to action. And you always act upon the strongest desire, subject always to the restraining influence of the reason, and the restricting or impelling influence of the will. I will tell you more about this wonderful thing, the will, in a moment or two, but let us now think of desire, for that is the real emotive power. Desire originates in the subconscious regions of the mind, and often we can feel her there, before she emerges into consciousness, stirring us up with feelings of vague discontent and unrest. After a bit, gathering enough force, she emerges into the conscious field, and then begins to demand expression. Now remember, that when I say desire, I mean all kinds of desire, high and low. Many people think of desire as only the craving of a low nature, but desire really means a feeling that wants something, and that something may be the very highest aspiration of the human mind. Now, this desire in all of its manifestations has a mighty power of attraction and influence. It manifests as the law of mentative attraction, which is constantly drawing toward us the things we desire, and also drawing us toward them. Not only is this true on the conscious plane, but even on the subconscious. Our desires constitute our nature, and our nature is always operating the mighty power of mentative attraction. The trouble with the most of us is that we allow our desire force to be scattered and diffused, thereby lessening its attractive power. It is only when we learn the secret of concentration and focusing the desire force by the will that we are able to get results above the average. The will is the director and controller of the desire force, and upon its training and management depends the powerful use of the latter. Desire force not only has its effect upon the person, and others near him, but it may be, and often is, sent for thousands of miles where it affects and influences others, in ways. Desire force is the mighty force which makes many of the phases of mind power possible. It spreads out from the mind of the person affecting and influencing others even at other parts of the world, if concentrated and directed by the will. It is a force beside which the X-ray and electricity fade into insignificance. It moves not merely blind, lifeless things, but the living minds, thoughts, emotions, passions, and actions of men. It is the force that rules the world, and its destinies. Like any other great natural force, it is capable of being used for good or evil. It is neither good nor evil, it is either or both, according to the mind in which it originates. What phase of mental effort is more apt to be a motive force, the cold, lifeless thought about an abstract metaphysical proposition, or a mathematical problem, on the one hand, and a warm vital wave of feeling, emotion, or passion, such as love, hate, ambition, aspiration, courage and desire on the other? And remember that these last mentioned all belong to the feeling side of the mind, and all are manifestations of elementary desire. Desire is at the bottom of all feeling. Before we can love or hate, there must be desire. Before we can have ambition or aspiration, there must be desire. Before we can manifest courage and energy, there must be desire. Desire for something must underlie all life action, desire conscious or subconscious. Abstract thought is a cold, bare thing, lacking vitality and warmth. Desire is filled with life, throbbing, longing, wanting, craving, insisting, and ever pressing outward toward action. Desire indeed is the phase of our mental action that is a motive force. And not only does desire incite us to action, move us to accomplish its ends, but it also, when sufficiently strong, surges out from our minds in great waves and clouds of invisible and subtle energy or force, and travels here and there toward the object of its inner urge, affecting, attracting, drawing, forcing the desired thing into submission to its cravings and demand. In the presence of some strong man or woman, that is, in the presence of one whose desire burns fiercely and strongly, and whose will has learned to concentrate the desire force, one may actually feel the impact of the elementary principle of mind as it vibrates in great waves from the brain and nervous system of such a one. Who has not met people who actually seem to be living desire and will? The source of desire force exists in every person, and it may be developed to a wonderful degree. The desires of many of you, of the majority of the race, in fact, never get further than the faint, want to stage. These people wish for things in a faint, pink tea way. They never want a thing hard enough to stir their desire force into action and make the thing come to them, or else make it take them to the thing. The majority of people do not know how to desire. They do not know what it is to be filled with that intense, eager, longing, craving, ravenous desire that fills them with a new and mighty force, and makes them demand things instead of merely asking for them. They are like sheep, pigeons, or rabbits, and sit meekly around while the strong ones of the race, the ones filled with masterful desire, walk around and pick up every good thing in sight. And it serves them right, too, for they are not exercising the force which nature has given them for the purpose of self-protection and use. They have had the elementary vigor and virility bleached out of them by the refinements of one phase of civilization, and have nearly lost all that goes to make up manly men, and natural women. They have become beggars, mendicants of nature, instead of masters of her. The forces of nature are at the disposal of the man of vigor and determination and desire. Such a one has but to knock at the door of attainment and have it opened to him. Instead of doing this, the majority of us sit around the doorsteps whining that the door shall be opened to us. In the name of human power, friends, get up, and fill yourself with powerful desire, then march up to the door and smite it fiercely with your mailed fist, demanding masterfully, "Open for me, the master. And, lo, it will fly open at your call. I have shown you that desire force is the great force underlying the phenomena of mental magic. But desire force without the aid of the will is like steam unconfined and undirected, and gunpowder fired in the open air, both wasted energy. The will is the lever and director of the great power of desire, and without its aid the latter is almost inoperative and ineffectual. Let us examine into the operation of the will. The will has two offices in connection with desire. These two offices may be spoken of as 1. The directing office, and 2. The protecting office. The will acts as the arouser, director, restrainer, concentrator, and manager of the great occult force of desire. What is generally known as willpower is often in reality merely desire force strongly concentrated and directed to a focus by the power of the will. Remember this, please, for it will enable you to form a better idea of the subject of willpower. Often when you hear willpower spoken of, whatever is attributed to it is really said of and attributed to desire force controlled, directed, and focused by will. The effort of the will is operated in the direction of this directing, focusing, concentrating, etc., and in the degree that the will is trained to do this, so is the degree of willpower of the individual. Not only is the will able to do this, but it is able also to direct the desire force into the mind of other persons, awakening similar vibrations there, and then by its own power the will is able to direct the desire force of the other persons into action, taking away that office from the will of the other persons, if there will be not strong enough in its protective office to resist the attack. The idea of willpower is more familiar to the minds of people than is that of desire force. All recognize the wonderful power of the will, and know of many instances of great accomplishment by reason of its power. And, yet, how few have stopped to consider that unless there was a preceding desire, there could be no manifestation of will. Unless a person desires, that is, wants to do a thing, he will manifest no willpower. But, on the other hand, one may desire to do a thing, and unless the will is aroused and applied, no action will occur. Desire arouses will, and will may stimulate desire. The two act and react upon each other. The two should work in unison, and the trained individual has both under control and pulling well together, like a well-trained team. Willpower is more than a mere determination to act, although that mental attitude and action is manifested in willpower. It is a living force. Desire is the sister, and will the brother twin. And both, together, manifest that which we know as dynamic mentation. Willpower is more than a mere mental faculty, it is a mighty attribute, the influence of which may extend far beyond the mind of the person manifesting it. The greatest feats of the occult magicians depend upon telementation operated by trained willpower. And the so-called great men of history, ancient and modern, had their source of strength in this willpower, which they trained and developed to an extraordinary degree. The exercise of will shows itself in two ways: 1. The mastery of one's own mind, and 2. The mastery of the minds of others. The second is well nigh impossible unless the first be accomplished. One must first train his mind so that he will hold it firmly in the grasp of the will, and prevent it from jumping this way and that way, instead of moving ahead to its purpose. When one has so trained his mind to be obedient to his will, that it can be held steady and one-pointed, as the Hindus say, then is he in a position to direct his mentative currents upon others to the best advantage. But so long as his mind is in a stage of disorganization, one faculty pulling this way, and another that way, and so on, he cannot hope to concentrate upon others the force that is being wasted in keeping order at home. When the mind is mastered by the will, then may new territory be conquered. The term, willpower, is commonly used in connection with the manifestation of firmness, or determination. The determined will is known as a mighty factor toward attainment and accomplishment. And I think it well to consider this fact at this point, for back of all outward manifestations of mentative influence along active lines, lies this determined will of the individual. The more determined and firm the will of the individual, the stronger the mentative influence emitted and emanated by him. This statement should not require proof, for its truth is apparent to all who have made a study of man and his powers. It has been recognized by writers in all times. Here are a few quotations that will tend to fix the matter firmly in your mind, and create in you a desire to manifest the determined will, the lever that directs and concentrates mind power. Buxton said, "The longer I live, the more certain I am that the great difference between men, between the feeble and the powerful, the great and the insignificant, is energy, invincible determination or a purpose once fixed, and then victory or death. That quality will do anything that can be done in this world, and no talents, no circumstances, no opportunities will make a two-legged creature a man without it." Donald G. Mitchell said, "Resolve is what makes a man manifest, not puny resolve, not crude determination, not errant purpose, but that strong and indefatigable will which treads down difficulties and danger, as a boy treads down the heaving frostlands of winter, which kindles his iron brain with a proud pulse beat toward the unattainable. Will makes men giants." Disraeli said, "I have brought myself by long meditation to the conviction that a human being with a settled purpose must accomplish it, and that nothing can resist a will which will stake even existence upon its fulfillment." Sir John Simpson said, "A passionate desire and an unwearied will can perform impossibilities, or what may seem to be such to the cold and feeble." John Foster said, "It is wonderful how even the casualties of life seem to bow to a spirit that will not bow to them, and yield to subserve a design which they may, in their first apparent tendency, threaten to frustrate. When a firm, decisive spirit is recognized, it is curious to see how the space clears around a man and leaves him room and freedom." As we have seen, the use of the will as the projector of mentative currents is the real base of all mentative induction, under whatever name it may manifest. And the phase of will known as telementation is the form the results of which strike the observer with the greatest force. The will currents of a strong man reach out far beyond the limits of his brain, and influence people and things, causing them to be inclined toward his wishes. Many men have worked their will upon others far removed, and much that is known as thought transference, telepathy, mental influence, etc., is really this working of the will currents over space. What occultists have called thought forms, etc., are really manifestations of the energy of the will. Will is a living force that can be projected and operated at a distance. It has a property of reacting upon others, and permeating them with a mental essence not their own, unless they repel the invasion or fortify themselves against the aggression. Desire and will are more elementary forms of mentation than thought. They underlie thought. Without desire and will there can be no thought. They ever precede thought, and are closely allied to the essence of what we call feeling. Many people live almost altogether on the feeling plane, and exercise but little thought. The infant feels, desires and wills before it can think. Desire and will are really the medium from which thought is evolved. A modern writer on mysticism has said, "There is no force in the universe except will force," meaning, of course, the great natural force of energy called will, of which desire and will in man are expressions. Desire is a natural force, and can be used, managed, controlled, and directed just as can be any other natural force. And what we know as willpower is the positive phase of directed desire. The Orientals have trained and cultivated this willpower to degrees that seem miraculous to the Western mind, and by this trained willpower they perform the so-called miracles that confound the Western scientist. But even the West has its men of iron will, whose influence is felt on all sides, and whose power is openly acknowledged by the public. In the East these men are generally hermits and sages, while in the West they are generally men of action, leaders, captains of industry, etc. Mind power is the essence of all mentative induction. It includes the positive, forcing, impelling, compelling, driving phase called will as its motive pole, and as its emotive pole it has that attracting, drawing, pulling, luring, charming, fascinating, something that we call desire. Mind power manifests in the phases of both desire and will, as we generally use these terms, for it is composed of the elements of both. Will may be said to represent the masculine side of mind power, and desire the feminine side. It may help you to fix in your mind the attributes, characteristics, and nature of these two phases of mentative energy by associating them with the idea of masculine and feminine. I wish that you would learn to think of the desire force as the warm, ardent, fiery, forceful energy underlying the manifestations of mind power, and of the will power as the cold, keen, strong, directing, controlling projector of the energy. By fixing these mental images in your mind, you will be better able to manifest the two phases as occasion arises. Besides its office as the director of the energy, the will serves a very important office as the restrainer of desire force. When under the control of the I of the person, and taking the suggestion of reason and judgment, it is able to prevent one from expressing undesirable or hurtful desires. It refuses to project the desire force, or to allow the desire to take effect in action. It also turns back the desire upon itself, and refuses to allow it to manifest. It is the utmost importance that the individual acquire a mastery of his will, for by doing so he will be able not only to express his desires with the greatest force and effect, but will also be enabled to restrain hurtful desires, and to prevent their manifestation upon the plane of action. And the will has still another important office. It acts as a protector. The will repels the influence or vibrations of another mind, and renders its possessor immune to undesirable thought waves. It creates a protective aura around the individual, which will turn aside the thought waves or vibrations which may reach him, whether such be sent directly to him or whether they are the vibrations emanating from minds of others and unconsciously sent forth. The will when properly used acts as an insulator for attacks upon the desire pole of one's mind, and prevents the vibrations from reaching their mark. And if it be well trained and strengthened, it will be able also to resist the most powerful attacks upon it by the wills of others, and will beat back the vibrations which would force their way into its stronghold to take it captive. Chapter 7. Desire and Will in Fable. I herewith reproduce the fable of the mentative couple, a bit of writing in the lighter vein perpetrated by myself about a year ago. My excuse for writing this tale, and for reproducing it now, is that it carries with it a decided moral, and teaches an important truth. It brings out the distinction existing between the motive and the emotive phases of the mind, and beneath its flippancy is concealed some good, sound psychological truth. I ask that you read it, in connection with what I have just told you regarding the offices of the will, desire, imagination, etc. It will show you, in figurative style, the operation of the two poles of the desire will. And it will show you how the emotive pole or phase, if left unguarded by the protective faculties, will be led into all sorts of trouble. It will also show you how the protective faculty may be disarmed and overcome by a diversion of its attention from its task. There are several important psychological facts brought out in this little fable, and a number of important morals to be deduced therefrom. I trust that you will seek for the truth and principles underlying the trifling words of the fable. Just as important truths may be conveyed in the fairy tales of the child, so may just as important facts be taught by the fairy tale fable of the mentative couple intended for the grown-ups. Each of us, man or woman, has a mentative castle, in which dwells a mentative couple, volos and emotion. And volos often strays away, leaving emotion unprotected. And the fascinating stranger often puts in an appearance. An emotion often is beguiled by his wiles. And Volos often is fooled by having his attention and interest distracted by clever schemes, leaving emotion unprotected again. So, while recognizing the value of emotion, learn to keep Volos at home at the gate of the castle, and do not allow him to be sidetracked. Heed the advice of the wise man of the fable. There is an important lesson for you in this fable if you will take the trouble to find it. The fable of the Mentative couple. Once upon a time there lived in the land of Mental-Dynamo, in a wonderful building called the Mentative Castle, a man and a woman, called the Mentative couple. They were happy though married. They lived in harmony, because they were useful to one another, and neither was complete without the presence of the other, and neither did his nor her best work, unless the other was present and assisting. Well, now, the man was called Volos, which is the same as the English name will, and the woman was called Emotion, which in the language of that country meant something like a combination of emotion, desire, and imagination. Now, the chronicle informs us that these two people had natures entirely different from each other, as has been said. We are told that Volos was of a stern, inflexible, strong, positive nature, apt to stick to a thing once begun, full of the will to live and vitality, full of determination and spirit, with a strong dash of the let me alone and get out of my way in his makeup, with a taste for meeting difficulties and overcoming obstacles, with a goodly habit of reaching out and taking hold of what emotion wanted and needed, and a powerful lot of self-respect and self-reliance in him. He was apt to be firm, although his firmness was not the stubbornness of the mule. His general keynote was strength. He was a good warrior and defender of his castle. But Emotion was of an entirely different type, temperament, and character. She was most impressionable, imaginative, emotional, credulous, fanciful, full of desire, curious, sympathetic, and easily persuaded. While Volos was all willing and thinking, Emotion was all feeling. Volos was a strong character, but lacked certain qualities that make for success, but these qualities Emotion possessed, and she supplied the deficiency in Volos. Volos had to figure out everything, while Emotion had intuition, and jumped at a conclusion in a way remarkable to Volos, who couldn't understand the process at all. When he would ask Emotion for an explanation, she would say, lightly, "Oh, just because." Which answer would often provoke profane and irreverent discourse on the part of Volos. But, nevertheless, he learned to respect these because of Emotion, and found that they helped him in his business. Emotion would dream out things, and see things a long way ahead, and then Volos would proceed to put these plans into operation. Volos couldn't see very far ahead of his nose, while Emotion could see miles beyond, and years ahead. And besides this faculty of mental imagery that came in so useful in Volos' business, Emotion also possessed a burning and ardent desire for things, which she managed to communicate to Volos, thereby causing him to get out and do things that otherwise he would never have dreamed of doing. Emotion was like fire, and Volos like water. The water would hold the fire in check, but at the same time the fire would heat up the water, and the result would be the steam of action. And so, you see, these two, this Mentative couple, formed a fine co-partnership, and prospered mightily. But, alas! The tempter entered Eden, and the attractive stranger meandered in the direction of the Mentative castle, and when he reached there trouble occurred. And this is what happened. One day Volos was absent from the castle, being engaged in some arduous enterprise. And consequently the castle was unguarded. Volos had provided against this by instructing Emotion that she was to keep the castle gate closed tight, when he was away from home, and never to gaze without in his absence, for there was some mysterious danger lurking without when he was away. Emotion had faithfully followed the directions of her liege lord, although her womanly curiosity was piqued thereat. Many the time she had heard strange knockings at the castle gate, but she heeded them not, and even refrained from looking out of the little peephole in the gate, though this last was much against her inclination, for she could see no harm in just looking. But, to return to our tale. This particular day when Volos was absent from home, her curiosity was too much for emotion when she heard the strange knockings at the gate. And, breaking her rule, she ventured to peep without. Looking down, she saw a most attractive stranger, with a fascinating smile on his lips. He looked almost as strong as Volos, but he seemed to have a dash of the woman in him, besides. He had the strength, but also the charm that emotion recognized as being a part of her own nature. A side emotion, here is a man who can understand me. The fascinating stranger smiled sweetly, and looking her in the eyes, masterfully asked to be admitted. No, no, replied emotion, I cannot let you in, for Volos told me not to. Ah, fair lady, said the stranger softly. Volos means all right, but he is rather old fogyish, and behind the times. He does not understand, as do you, and I pray, let me in. And, like Mother Eve, emotion took the bait. Well, to make a long story short, when Volos came home he found that emotion had subscribed to a set of Villavos Modern Art, a beautiful work published by the Deluxe Brothers of Fifth Avenue, to be issued in 824 weekly parts, at the nominal price of $5 a part, 739 parts of which were already out, and would be delivered shortly. She had also given a number of side orders for manifold wares, which had dazzled her untrained and unguarded fancy. Volos cried aloud to the gods of his land, but it was too late, the contracts had been signed. But this was but the beginning. Volos did not understand just what was the matter, and contented himself with scolding emotion, whereat she wept bitterly. But the poison went on with its deadly work. And when Volos again was absent from home, the habit reasserted itself, and when the fascinating stranger again called at the castle, he was admitted. And when Volos returned, he found the castle furnished from dungeon to watchtower with costly rugs, and furniture, and various other articles, bought from Morgenstern's popular installment house, at $1,000 down and $100 per week. He also found that the castle had been lightning rodded from ground to turret, on each wing, tower, and annex, and that sundry promissory notes, containing a law-proof, judgment-confessed clause, had been given in exchange therefor. And then Volos swore by the beard of Mars, the war god, that he would have no more of this, he would remain at home thereafter. And he did. But the subtle stranger was onto the game, in all of its details. And this is how he played it on Volos, even though the latter remained at home. A few days after Volos had determined to remain at home, there came a band of mountebanks, singing, dancing, and performing juggling tricks. Volos sat on the great stone beside the open castle gate, and his attention was attracted by the sounds and sights. Faster the dancers whirled, louder beat the drums, sweeter grew the singing, more bewildering grew the feats of jugglery, until poor Volos forgot all about the open castle gate, so rapt was he at the strange sights, sounds, dances, and feats of jugglery. Then one of the mountebank gang, who was really the attractive stranger disguised in motley array, slipped, unseen, past Volos, and in a moment was engaged in eager conversation with the impressionable emotion. Volos watched the crowd until it moved away, and then entering the castle, and closing the gate behind him, was confronted by emotion, in tears, for she dreaded the coming storm. Alack a day, woe is me, she cried, I am again in trouble, oh, Volos, my liege lord. I have just ordered from the fascinating stranger, who slipped past you at the gate, a babygrand, self-playing, automatic, liquid air-valved, radium carburetor, piano-playing, organette, upon which I may play for you all classes of music, ranging from Wagner's Gotterdammerung to the popular Merry Widow waltz with feeling, depth of expression, and soulful understanding, according to the words of the fascinating stranger who took my order. Gadzooks, ejaculated Volos, fain would I cry aloud the name of that production of Wagner's just mentioned by thee. And by my halidom, e'en shalt thou soon be performing the waltz just mentioned by thy false red lips. Zounds! of a truth I have been stung again by that fascinating stranger. I must gaze no more upon these fleeting scenes of merriment and amazement, lest I be again decorated with the ass's ears. Aha! Volos is himself again, and the next time the fascinating stranger appears upon the scene, he shall be smitten hip and thigh with my trusty battle-axe, and my snickersee shall pierce his foul carcass. But, alas! Even once more was poor Volos deceived and trifled with, once more poor emotion fascinated by the stranger. And it came about in this way. On the day of his last undoing, Volos sat on the open step, in front of the narrowly opened castle door. "No man shall pass me now," cried he. But fate willed otherwise. For as he sat there approached many people who took seat upon the steps before the gate, and engaged Volos in long-heated and wearisome discourses regarding the outlook for the crops, the presidential campaign, the Japanese question, race suicide, the new theology, how old was Anne, the problem of the final outcome of the collision between the irresistible force and the immovable body, the canals on Mars, what Roosevelt will do with his big stick when his term expires, and many other weighty, interesting, and fascinating topics of general interest. Most agreeable were these visitors, and most considerate of Volos' feelings were they. And although they seemed to differ from him at the beginning of each argument, still they courteously allowed him to convince them inch by inch, until they finally acknowledged that he was invincible in argument, and invulnerable in logic. "'Tis passing strange," quoth Volos, "but nevertheless 'tis true, that I always find myself on the right side of every question. And the wonder grows when they all admit it in the end. Verily, am I developing into a wise guy?" And, pondering thus, he fell sweetly asleep from the rigor of the disputes, the flattering attentions shown him, the joy of the victory, and the exceeding amount of attention and interest he had expended, for human nature has its limitations, even in the case of one so strong as Volos. And while he slumbered, the fascinating stranger, who was really the leader of the argumentative visiting committee, crept into the house and unloaded upon emotion a choice collection of gilt-edged mining stock, pure gilt, all the way through, in fact, a bunch of flying machine bonds, and a 5,000 monkey power, vestibule drawing room, observation car automobile called the Yellow Peril. And when Volos discovered what had happened he wept aloud, crying bitterly, "Odds bones, death of a certain the Baron E.Z. Mark." And thereupon he sent for the wise man who dwelt in the next barony. The wise man came, and after hearing the story said, "My children, yours is a sad case, but matters may be adjusted without a visit to Sioux Falls, and without the raising of the question of alimony. The trouble is as follows: Volos, without emotion, has no desire or incentive to do things. He has no wants to satisfy, and therefore does nothing. He needs emotion to supply the desire. And without her he has no feeling, he is nothing but a hard-shell clam. Therefore he needs her to supply the feeling, for verily, and of a truth, feeling is the spice of life. And without her he has no imagination, and cannot see beyond the end of his nose, and what is life without imagination? Gadzooks, one might as well be a mummy. And on the other hand, emotion without Volos, is a consuming fire of desire, an unrestrained imagination, an intuitive faculty degenerated into the basest superstition, most deplorable credulity, and the idlest fancy. Volos has no desire, emotion, or imagination of his own, and emotion has no will of her own. Verily, cannot it be seen by all that this couple needs one another the worst way? Each, alone, is but an incomplete half. United they stand, divided they fall. In union alone is there strength for them. And more than this, each, without the other, falls a prey to the wiles of some fascinating stranger. We have seen how emotion was fascinated and controlled by the stranger who gained access to the castle. But I have also seen, by my magic art, that when Volos was away from home on important business, and not having emotion along to keep him straight, he fell a victim to the wiles of the desire and imagination of a fair stranger across the river, and did her bidding, and used his will to perform her tasks, instead of those desired by his own emotion. Verily, art these people quits with one another and should now begin over again. True it is that harmony will be theirs only when they are together. And this is the secret of the undoing of emotion. Without the will of Volos to protect her, direct her, and advise her, emotion allowed her desire imagination, and emotion to run wild and unrestrained. And so she became so impressionable as to allow herself to be mastered by the will of the stranger, who took advantage of the same and gathered to himself many choice orders for things. And even when Volos sat by the door watching the players, dancers, and jugglers, his attention was so centered on what he saw, that the fascinating stranger slipped through the gate. It was even as if Volos had been absent from home. And, again, when Volos allowed himself to become engaged in weighty discourse with the visiting committee, and used up his energy and force in argument and dispute with them, and when he permitted himself to be jollied into a false security by these united brethren of the Blarney Stone, he relaxed his vigilance, and allowed himself to become tired, drowsy, and sleepy, and so fell into a doze at his post, and the stranger again entered and took emotion's orders for goods. And this then is the remedy, as my successor, Lawson of Boston, will say in the centuries to follow, this is the remedy. Each person of this mentative couple must stick close to the other. Volos must have no important businesses across the river, which will allow emotion to be without a protector and advisor. An emotion must stick close to Volos, and satisfy her curiosity, imagination, emotion, and desire, by setting him to work out things for her, to do things dreamed of by her, to get her things she desires, to express the things felt by her. This is the secret of success, dear mentative couple, mutual work by desire and will, working in unison and harmony, each faithful to the other, each guarding the other from the fascinating strangers that beset each when separated. Now, then children, stick close to each other. And saying this, the wise man vanished from sight. And the moral of this fable of the mentative couple is this, that the mind of every man and woman is a mentative castle, wherein dwells a Volos and an emotion. And what happened to the couple in the fable, may happen, and does happen, to many in everyday life. The will, straying from home, and paying attention to other attractions, leaves the castle unguarded, and the fascinating stranger enters. And, again, the will has its attention distracted by passing objects of interest, and forgets the castle door. And again, the will allows itself to be fatigued, tired, and jollied by useless argument, and talk, and cogitation, at the instigation of the designing fascinating stranger, and the latter slips past the gate. And in each case, inside the gate is emotion unprotected and innocent, true to her own nature, credulous, imaginative, fanciful, desireful, and emotional. Is it any wonder that she orders goods that are not wanted by the family? And the remedy of the wise man as given to the mentative couple may be, and should be, applied by every man and woman in his or her mental castle. And this then is the moral of the fable. And thus endeth the fable of the mentative couple, who dwell in the mentative castle, in Mentalvania, in the days of old when brave knights held their sway and fair ladies had their way. The end of the fable of the mentative couple. Chapter 8. Mind Power in Action. And now let us consider the subject of the operation of mind power, in the phase of its employment, consciously or unconsciously, to affect the minds of others. It is true that this subject will be considered in detail in the chapter on personal magnetism and telementation, but it will be well for us to take a glance at the general workings at this point. I shall cover the points briefly, the elaboration being made at the proper points in the lessons. In the first place, let us consider the matter of mentative induction. As you have seen, the currents of mind power flow in vibratory waves from the mind of the individual, and act upon the minds of others according to the laws of mentative induction. They thus set up corresponding vibrations, and therefore corresponding mental states of feelings, in the minds of such people. In other words, these vibrations induce or set up by induction in the minds of others, mental states similar to those existing in the mind of the mentator. These induced mental states are similar in quality and nature to those in the original mind. But, of course, they are less in degree, for a part of the original energy has been dissipated in many directions, and then again, a certain amount of force is lost according to the degree of resistance in the receiving mind. If the receiving mind sets up, consciously or unconsciously, a considerable resistance to the vibrations, it will either entirely neutralize or repel them, or else rob them of much of their power. If, on the contrary, the receiving mind be in its nature more or less in accord with the vibrations, it will set up little or no resistance, and the induced condition will be very nearly as strong as the original impulse. The ether, or fine substance filling space, is constantly filled with these mentative currents, of all kinds and degrees, streaming out from the minds of all kinds of people. These currents, of course, come in contact with each other, and often either combine or else act to neutralize each other. For instance, currents of a certain degree or kind of vibration, that is, of a certain mental state, when they come in contact with other currents of similar vibration, will tend to coalesce and combine, there being a harmony and attraction existing between them. But if they are opposing vibrations, they will antagonize each other and act in the direction of neutralizing each other's force. If they are of equal strength, both will lose power, but if one is much stronger than the other, it will lose only in the inverse ratio of its strength, and the weaker will suffer likewise. That is, the weaker will lose twice as much power as the stronger, and the stronger will lose only half as much as the weaker, supposing that the stronger is of twice the strength of the weaker. In this way is accounted for the well-known fact that places, towns, cities, etc., have their own personal atmospheres, which affect persons living in them or visiting them. These personal atmospheres of towns arise from a combining, neutralizing, etc., of the various vibrations arising from mentative currents from the minds of the people living in the town. An average vibration is struck, which is strongly felt by all within the field of induction of that town. A little thought will make it clear to you that this is a correct statement of the mental conditions manifest in various towns, cities, etc., all over the world. Each place has its own individuality, which soon makes its impression on those taking up their abode in it. It is more than geographical and atmospheric conditions, although, of course, these play their parts, as we all know. The average mental state of the people living in the town strikes the keynote. The stronger vibrations affect the average, and give a mental tone to the place. The best proof of this effect being caused by mental vibrations is found in the fact that two towns only a few miles from each other, each having the same atmospheric and geographical conditions, will manifest entirely different mental atmospheres. People often ask, if it be true that the ether is filled with mentative currents, why are we not affected more than we are? The answer is that they are affected more than they imagine, but they are still affected much less than one would suppose at first thought, for the reason that the currents conflict with each other and rob each other of their force. And then again, nature instinctively affords a safeguard and sets up additional powers of resistance. Just as nature protects the hearing sense of those who are surrounded with many and constant noises, until they fail to hear anything but an unaccustomed noise, just as she operates upon the smelling sense of the chemist until he fails to notice the odors which are most apparent to the stranger entering his shop, so does she give additional unconscious resisting power to people situated within an active field of mentative induction. Bring a person from a quiet place into a bustling, active city, and he is apt to be swept off his feet at first with the spirit of the place. He will either be swept into its prevailing life with an almost irresistible impulse, or else he will be repelled by reason of the inharmonious mentative currents. In either case, however, he will be intensely aware of the vibrations. But, the same man, after a time, will fail to be so affected. He will be better able to resist the vibrations and will manage to live with a greater peace and poise than at first, although he will, of course, alter his nature more or less in harmony with the prevailing tone of the place. He will feel the vibrations less as time goes on. Some people have so developed this resisting power that they are almost immune, while others have so little power of resistance that they are swept here and there by each strong wave of mentative energy that reaches them. They are always in some field of induction and being swayed by its vibrations. This phase of mentative induction explains the phenomena of those great waves of feeling that sweep over a country, such as the emotion that followed the sinking of the Maine in the harbor of Havana. You will remember the first shock that came to you when you read the account in the morning papers. Then there came upon you a growing sense of some impending event of great moment, mingled with a feeling of horror and indignation, followed by an almost irresistible desire to join in a movement to avenge the outrage. This latter feeling grew perceptibly as wave after wave of feeling passed over the country in mentative currents, setting up increased mental feeling by induction. Older people will remember many similar waves that swept over the land in past days. These things are common, and give you a clue to the apparent mystery of the action of mobs composed of a number of individuals who combine in numbers and then commit acts that no one man of the lot would think of perpetrating singly or individually. The conscience of the mob is apparently a thing apart from the individual consciences of the units composing it. After the excitement, the morning after, many, if not all, of the persons concerned, felt a sickening horror and wonder at their work. A mob is a cyclonic center of mentative currents, resembling a whirlpool or whirlwind, with an active center and a less active circumference. Great waves of religious fervor noticeable in communities during the progress of revivals are accounted for in the same way. A few active revivalists start a whirlwind of fervid feeling and emotion, and it spreads out in constantly widening circles, increasing until a climax is reached, and then a diminishing strength is apparent, which gradually settles down into the accustomed mental state of the community. These whirlwinds or whirlpools of emotional excitement, of whatever kind, are, of course, strengthened by the constantly repeated suggestions of those participating in it, which with the constantly growing volume of mentative energy being thrown forth serves to add fuel to the fire. This force would go on forever, steadily gaining in strength and volume, were it not for a provision of nature which causes the law of rise and fall, increase and decrease, that universal law of rhythm, to manifest in this as in all else in her domain. Everything has its rise, its climax, and its decline. So much for these general waves of mentative energy, or mentative currents. But there is another phase to be considered, many phases, in fact. Let us examine them. First, there are mentative currents, arising from the strong-centered desire of some person, who forming a strong mental image, by means of visualization, creates for himself a center of desire force, which guided by his willpower attracts to himself all that will fit into his plans. He constitutes himself a mentative center, around his visualized idea, and constantly sends out strong mentative currents charged with the strongest, most ardent desire force, guided, directed, and projected by his developed willpower. He thus sets into operation the great mental law of attraction, of which the early writers on mental science talked so much. These mentative currents, charged with desire, spread out, and soon begin a rotary movement like a whirlpool, sweeping around and around, always drawing in toward its center persons and things tending to fit in with the plans of the center. The original desire in the man's mind is reproduced in kind in the minds of thousands of people by the law of mentative induction, and they all fall in with the plan, the degree, of course, depending upon the degree of positivity or negativity of the receptive mind, multiplied by the degree of positivity of the mentator. The great plans of the so-called captains of industry are carried out by reason of this law. Many of these great centers of desire force, these successful men, who attract to them that which they want, and those whom they need, do not realize the nature of the force that they are using, but there are a constantly increasing number who do know it, and they are working it for all it is worth. Many of these steady, cool business leaders are really deeply versed in occult laws. If the true facts of the case were to creep out, there would be the greatest sensation that the country has ever known. Then there is still another phase of the matter. I allude to the cases of men who, generally consciously, but sometimes unconsciously, are focusing their mentative currents directly upon some person or persons who are necessary to their plans and desires. They are filled with desire to have these persons do thus and so, or not do thus and so, as the case may be. These men, according to their degree of concentration and willpower, direct to the other person or persons strong mentative currents of desire force, and by mentative induction set up vibrations of a corresponding rate in the minds of these others, the degree of effect produced, of course, depending upon the degree of negativity of the recipient. This effect is produced in two ways, both according to the law of mentative induction. The first way is to set up corresponding desire vibrations in the mind of the other, so that it will in turn cause his will to carry out the desire. A variation of this is to direct the desire force toward the will of the other, and thus entice or charm the other's will into compliance with the desire of the sender. This will be understood if you will remember what I have said about the resemblance of the desire pole to the feminine, and the will pole to the masculine. You will see an illustration of this in every phase of mentative influence. The second way is for the will of the sender to force its way past the will of the other and boldly make love to the desire of the other, and endeavor to seduce it by mere strength and persistency until it accedes to his wishes. The variation of this is seen in the case where the attacking will boldly grapples with the will of the other, and by sheer superiority of power overcomes it and makes it captive and obedient. This latter is very rare, except in cases of personal interviews between the two persons, aided by telementation between interviews. You will notice that the phase in which the desire pole of the mentator does the work is along the lines of feminine action, the force being of a charming, fascinating, drawing, coaxing nature, and where the will is employed, the action is decidedly masculine, the attack being made boldly, and with a show of strength, the subtlety of the desire attraction being absent. The giants in the art of mentative attraction combine poles in their attacks and work, and thus in the words of Uncle Remus, "Day Cochem coming, and day Cochem going, like Brer Fox." Then again, there is the use of mentative induction, in what is known as personal magnetism, which we will see in other chapters of this book. In this phase the mentator pours forth his mentative currents either in a general way, or else in a concentrated, directed manner, toward the other, in a personal interview. This is the secret of what is called personal magnetism, and also of that unaccountable, to the uninformed, manner which some people have of overpowering others by sheer strength of will. The personal magnetism phase of personal influence is the phase of feminine activity, and the force of will phase is the phase of masculine activity. Then there is that form of mentative induction called mental suggestion, which I take up in later chapters. Although suggestion has to do with words, etc., rather than with mentative currents, still the principle is the same. The mental state is induced by words or physical things which are the result of feeling and mental states, just as is the phonographic record the result of the original speech which it is able to reproduce when the diaphragm is brought in contact with it by means of the needle. And then there is very little mental suggestion that is not accomplished with mentative currents, very little, indeed. In closing this lesson I wish to caution my readers to refrain from manifesting or feeling anything like fear at what I have said about the use of mentative energy by other people. Remember, that fear in itself is the most negative influence and most weakening mental state known. It renders negative the most positive man if freely indulged in. No matter how potent may be these mentative currents, there are none that may not be rendered impotent and ineffectual by your own willpower set in motion by your own desire force. Each and every one of you have within you, and under your own control, a force that will render you perfectly and absolutely immune from undesirable mentative influence, no matter who may use it against you. Nature has blessed all of us in this respect. It makes no bane without its antidote, and does not depart from its rule in this phase any more than in any other. It supplies the means of self-protection to everyone, and always furnishes the defensive weapon to match the offensive one. As a matter of fact, you are defending yourself constantly, although you may not know it. Much of this defensive work is done along subconscious lines, but you are doing much of it consciously by the use of your will and spirit of individuality. You are using the mental no, all the time, that is, unless you are some poor creature who is afraid to say no, even mentally, and if you are that, then this book is doubly needed by you. I shall instruct every student of this book, in many different ways, as we proceed with the lessons in this art of self-protection. No one who studies this book need ever again fear any undue influence on the part of others. I purpose to make mental masters of you, and to teach you to throw off the bonds and shackles of mental slavery. I intend to make you strong, positive individuals, instead of weak, negative personalities. There is nothing to be afraid of except fear, so the sooner you cast off fear the better you will be, and the more advanced on the road to mastery. While this is not the place for exercises, still I want each and every one of you to start right in now and form a mental attitude of fearlessness and strength, that you may begin at once to send forth mentative currents of that rate of vibration. If you do so, and you will, I know, then you will begin to notice an improvement at once. You will begin to realize your increasing power, and you will also see that others are beginning to feel it. Begin today, this moment, to radiate mentative currents of strength and power in all directions. Stimulate the currents by arousing a strong, intense, burning desire to be strong and to radiate strength vibrations, then back this up by the application of a strong, steady, masterful and dominant will, and then the trick will be done. But right here, remember, first, last, and all the time, that it is not a mere matter of thinking, but a matter of feeling. Thoughts are cold, but feelings are warm, alive, and vital. Therefore you must not merely think I am strong, or say it like a parrot, but you must stir up your nature to its depth, until you can really feel that you are indeed strong and possessed of the radiant energy of mentative force. Feeling is living thought. Everything that is worthwhile was produced by this feeling thought. Feeling, desire, emotion, passion, wanting, willing, demanding, these are the things that have creative power. So do not deceive yourself with this holding the thought, or any such nonsense of which you have heard so much until you get sick at the mention of the words. It is not simply holding the thought, it is holding the desire, and backing it up with the will, that does the work. To create a thing you must want it with a burning, eager want that brooks no denial, backed up by a will that knows no such word as can't or no.